a dying baby, a stranger with a dead woman's ring, a killer hiding in plain sight. When frontier rancher Coulter Grayson found his infant son barely breathing in a sealed nursery, he thought fever had taken the child, until a scarred midwife arrived through a blizzard carrying his missing wife's wedding band and a warning that turned his blood cold. Someone in his own house was trying to murder his son. What happened next would drag them both into the frozen mountains, hunted by a monster wearing a trusted face, fighting not just for survival but for something neither believed they deserved anymore: a second chance at family. Stay with me until the end of this story, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels. The nursery smelled wrong. Coulter Grayson noticed it the moment he pushed open the door. Thick, stale air that sat heavy in his lungs like something dead. The fire in the hearth had burned down to ash hours ago, and frost crept along the window glass in delicate killing patterns. His son lay motionless in the cradle, lips tinged blue, chest rising and falling in shallow gasps that barely moved the blankets piled over his small body. No, 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 no. Coulter crossed the room in 3 strides and scooped the baby up, blankets and all. The child's skin felt cool against his calloused hands. Too cool. He pressed his palm against the tiny chest, felt the heartbeat fluttering weak and irregular like a bird with a broken wing. Wake up! Come on, son! Wake up! Nothing. The baby's head lolled against Coulter's shoulder, eyelids flickering but never opening. Panic clawed up Coulter's throat. He had no idea what to do. Evelyn would have known. Evelyn always knew, but Evelyn was gone. Had been gone for 3 weeks now, vanished into the mountains on a ride she'd said was important, that she couldn't explain, that she'd promised to come back from. She hadn't come back, and now their son was dying in his arms, and Coulter felt the same helpless rage that had been eating him alive since the day the search party came back empty-handed. Mr. Grayson? The voice came from behind him. Coulter spun around, instinctively pulling the baby closer to his chest. A woman stood in the doorway, tall, lean, dressed in a worn riding coat dusted with fresh snow. Her hair was dark and pulled back severe, and her face had the kind of hardness that came from seeing too much and surviving it anyway. She looked like she'd been awake for 3 days straight. "Who the hell are you?" Coulter's voice came out rough, almost a snarl. "How did you get in my house? Your foreman let me in." The woman stepped into the nursery without waiting for permission, her gaze moving past Coulter to scan the room with sharp, assessing eyes. "Said you'd been up here all night. Said the baby was sick." "That doesn't answer my question." Rowan Mercer. She crossed to the window and threw it open without asking. Cold air rushed in, sharp and clean. "I'm a midwife. I deliver babies, treat fevers, deal with illnesses most doctors won't touch. I didn't send for a midwife." "I know." Rowan turned back to face him, and for the first time Coulter saw something flicker across her expression, something that might have been sympathy if her face wasn't so guarded. "Your wife did." The words hit Coulter like a fist to the gut. "That's not possible. Evelyn's dead." "I know." Rowan's voice didn't soften, but it didn't have cruelty in it either, just fact. "I was there when she died." Coulter's legs felt unsteady. He sat down hard in the rocking chair beside the cradle, still holding his son against his chest. The baby made a small sound, barely a whimper, and Coulter's hand tightened protectively over the child's back. "You're lying." "Am I?" Rowan reached into her coat pocket and pulled something out. When she opened her palm, Coulter's entire world tilted sideways. Evelyn's wedding ring. The gold band caught the dim morning light, and Coulter recognized the small scratch on the inside where it had caught on a fence post years ago. He'd meant to have it repaired. Never did. Evelyn said she liked it that way, said it proved the ring had lived a real life with her. "Where did you get that?" His voice came out strangled. "She gave it to me before she died." Rowan closed her fingers around the ring again, but she didn't put it away. "Told me to bring it here, told me to find you and give you a message." "What message?" Rowan's jaw tightened. She glanced at the baby in Coulter's arms, then back at his face. "Someone in this house is trying to kill your son." The words hung in the air like smoke. Coulter stared at her, waiting for the punchline, for this to make sense. It didn't. Nothing about this made sense. A stranger appears in a snowstorm carrying his dead wife's ring and accuses someone under his own roof of trying to murder his child? It was insane. Get out. Listen to me. I said get out! Coulter stood, fury rising hot and fast to replace the shock. I don't know what kind of con you're running, but you picked the wrong house. My wife is gone. My son is sick. And you're standing here spinning stories like I'm stupid enough to. Look at this room. Rowan's voice cut through his anger like a blade. She gestured around the nursery with one hand, her movement sharp and deliberate. Window sealed shut, fire out, door closed. The air in here is so thick you can barely breathe it, and you've got 3 blankets piled on a baby who's already burning up with fever. You're not stupid, Mr. Grayson, but someone's been making damn sure you don't realize what's happening right in front of you. Coulter looked around the nursery as if seeing it for the first time. The sealed windows, the suffocating stillness. His foreman, Silas, had insisted on keeping the nursery warm, said babies couldn't handle the cold, that Coulter needed to keep the room sealed tight to protect the child from drafts. Coulter had believed him. The fever started 4 days ago, Rowan continued, her tone clipped and professional now. You've been told to keep him bundled, keep the room warm, keep everything quiet. Every piece of advice you've been given has been exactly wrong. Your son doesn't have a fever because he's sick. He has a fever because someone's been slowly suffocating him. Coulter looked down at the baby in his arms. The child's breathing was shallow, labored. His skin felt clammy now that Coulter was paying attention, and the longer he held him in this room, the worse he seemed to get. Who? Coulter's voice came out barely above a whisper. Who would do this? That's what your wife was trying to find out before she died. Rowan moved closer, her expression grim. She figured out something was wrong 3 weeks ago. Started asking questions, started digging into things that made people nervous. That's why she rode into the mountains. She was meeting someone who had information, someone who could tell her the truth. What truth? That your foreman, Silas Creed, has been involved in the deaths of at least 11 infants across this territory over the past 6 years. The room went silent except for the sound of wind howling through the open window. Coulter felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Silas had worked at Black Hollow Ranch for nearly 8 years. He was reliable, competent, loyal. He'd been the first person to offer condolences when Evelyn disappeared. He'd helped organize the search parties. He'd brought food to the house when Coulter was too grief-stricken to cook. That's impossible. Your wife didn't think so. Rowan reached into her coat again and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn and stained with what looked like dried blood. She wrote this 2 hours before she died. Made me promise I'd deliver it to you along with the ring. Coulter took the paper with shaking hands. He recognized Evelyn's handwriting immediately. The sharp, precise letters she'd learned from her schoolteacher mother, the way she looped the tail on her Y's. Coulter, if you're reading this, I didn't make it back. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for leaving you and our son, but I couldn't let this go. Too many babies have died, and I think I finally know why. Trust Rowan Mercer. She lost her own family to the same evil that's been hiding in plain sight across this territory. She'll protect our son when I can't. Silas isn't who you think he is. Get our baby away from him, please. I love you. I always will. E. Coulter read the letter 3 times before his hand stopped shaking enough to fold it again. His mind felt like it was moving through thick mud, trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't want to fit. Evelyn had known she might die. She'd ridden into those mountains anyway, and she'd sent this stranger, this Rowan Mercer, to finish what she'd started. How did she die? The question came out raw. Rowan's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Grief, maybe. Or guilt. Ambush. 3 men on horseback. They shot her twice before I could get to her. Her voice stayed steady, but Coulter heard the effort it took. She lived long enough to tell me about your son, long enough to make me swear I'd get here before it was too late. And the men who killed her? Dead. All 3. Rowan's jaw tightened. I made sure of it. Coulter believed her. There was something in the way she said it, flat, matter-of-fact, like she was reporting the weather. That told him this woman knew how to kill and didn't lose sleep over it when the situation called for it. Why you? Coulter asked. Why did Evelyn trust you? For the first time, Rowan's hard expression cracked just slightly. She looked away, focusing on the open window and the snow falling outside. Because I failed to save my own children, she said quietly. And your wife thought that meant I'd fight harder to save yours. The raw honesty in those words hit Coulter harder than any accusation could have. He studied Rowan's face, the lines around her eyes, the tightness in her jaw, the way she held herself like someone who'd been carrying weight too heavy to set down. How many children did you lose?
3. The word came out clipped. And my husband. Fever took all of them within a month, 4 years ago. I'm sorry.
Rowan's laugh was bitter and short. Don't be. I'm not telling you for sympathy. I'm telling you so you understand why I'm here. Your wife gave me a chance to stop the man who's been killing babies across this territory for years. She gave me a chance to make sure what happened to my family doesn't happen to anyone else. That's why I rode through a blizzard to get here. That's why I'm not leaving until your son is safe. Coulter looked down at the baby in his arms. His son. The last piece of Evelyn he had left in this world. The thought of someone deliberately hurting this child made rage burn so hot in his chest he could barely breathe. What do you need me to do? Right now, let me save your son's life. Rowan moved toward him, hands already reaching for the baby. After that, we figure out how to keep him alive long enough to bury the bastard who's been trying to kill him. Coulter hesitated for only a second before handing the baby over. Rowan took the child with the kind of practiced confidence that came from years of experience, supporting the small head with one hand while the other peeled away the suffocating blankets. Water, she said without looking up. Cold as you can get it. And clean cloths. Coulter moved on instinct, grabbing the pitcher from the washstand. His hands shook as he poured water into the basin, and he had to stop twice to steady himself. By the time he brought the basin and cloths to Rowan, she'd stripped the baby down to just a thin cotton shirt and had laid him on the changing table near the open window. Is he going to die? The question came out before Coulter could stop it. Not if I can help it. Rowan dipped a cloth in the cold water and began gently wiping down the baby's arms and legs. But the next few hours are going to be rough. His body's been working too hard for too long. We need to bring his temperature down slowly, get clean air into his lungs, and pray we're not too late. The baby made a weak sound, something between a whimper and a cry. Coulter's chest tightened. Talk to him, Rowan said, still working methodically. He knows your voice. Let him hear it. Coulter moved closer, placing one hand on his son's small chest. The heartbeat beneath his palm felt stronger already, or maybe that was just wishful thinking. Hey, little man, he said softly. I'm right here. We both are. You're going to be okay. The baby's eyelids fluttered. That's it, Rowan murmured. Come on, sweetheart, come back to us. She kept working, kept cooling the small body with patient, practiced movements. Coulter watched her hands, scarred, calloused, steady, and realized his wife had been right to trust this woman. Whatever else Rowan Mercer might be, she knew how to fight for a child's life. Time moved strange after that. Minutes felt like hours. The baby's breathing stayed shallow, but gradually became more regular. The blue tint around his lips began to fade, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, color started creeping back into his small face. Then, just when Coulter thought he couldn't take the waiting anymore, the baby opened his eyes and let out a real cry. Not the weak, pitiful sounds from before. A real, angry, healthy cry that filled the nursery and made Coulter's knees go weak with relief. There you are, Rowan said, and for the first time since she'd walked into the house, she almost smiled. Welcome back. She wrapped the baby in a single light blanket and handed him to Coulter. The child fussed and squirmed, clearly unhappy about being cold and wet and awake. But the strength in those movements was the most beautiful thing Coulter had ever felt. He's going to be okay. Coulter heard the desperation in his own voice and didn't care. For now. Rowan wiped her hands on a dry cloth, her expression turning serious again. But we can't keep him here. Whoever's been doing this will try again as soon as they realize he's recovering. Silas. Most likely. But we need proof before we can move against him. Rowan crossed to the window and looked out at the snow-covered ranch below. And we need to keep your son safe while we get it. Coulter's mind raced. Black Hollow Ranch covered 3,000 acres of Montana frontier, but right now it felt like a cage. If Silas really was trying to kill his son, then every room in this house was a potential death trap. There's a line shack about 5 miles northeast, he said. Used to use it during winter roundups. It's got a stove, bunks, Enough supplies to last a few days. Can you get there without being seen? Maybe. If we leave before dawn. Coulter looked down at his son, who had finally quieted down and was making sleepy sounds against his shoulder. But what about you? I'll stay here. Keep playing the role of the midwife who showed up too late to help. Rowan's expression hardened. If Silas thinks the baby's still dying, he won't suspect anything, and while he's focused on finishing what he started, I'll find the proof we need. That's too dangerous. Rowan's laugh was sharp. Mr. Grayson, I killed 3 men on a frozen mountain 2 weeks ago. I rode through a blizzard with your wife's body strapped to my horse because I couldn't give her a proper burial and still make it here in time. Dangerous is relative. Coulter wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes told him it would be pointless. Rowan Mercer had already decided what she was willing to risk, and nothing he said was going to change her mind. What kind of proof are you looking for?
Records. Letters.
Anything that connects Silas to the other deaths. Rowan turned away from the window. Your wife mentioned that he kept a ledger, said she'd seen him writing in it late at night, always locked it away when anyone came near. His office is in the barn. Then that's where I'll start. A sound from downstairs made them both freeze. Footsteps on the wooden floor, heavy and deliberate. Then a voice called up the stairs, familiar, concerned, exactly the way it had sounded every day for the past 3 weeks. Mr. Grayson, everything all right up there? Thought I heard the baby crying. Silas. Coulter and Rowan locked eyes. For a single moment, the air in the nursery felt charged with possibility. Run, fight, confront, hide. 100 choices compressed into one heartbeat. Then Coulter made his decision. Fine, Silas, he called back, keeping his voice steady. Baby's fever broke. The midwife here got him settled down. Midwife? A pause. Didn't know we sent for one. Showed up on her own, said she heard we needed help. Another pause, longer this time. Coulter could almost hear Silas thinking, calculating, trying to figure out if this was a problem. Well, that's mighty fortunate, Silas finally said. I'll be in the barn if you need anything. The footsteps retreated. A door closed. Rowan let out a breath. He knows something's wrong. Yeah. Coulter adjusted his grip on the baby, who had fallen asleep again, this time peacefully. Which means we don't have much time. Then we'd better move fast. Rowan pulled her coat tighter and headed for the door. Get your son ready to travel. I'll pack supplies and meet you at the north pasture gate in 2 hours. If I'm not there by then, don't wait. Just run. Rowan, she stopped in the doorway but didn't turn around. Your wife trusted me with the most important thing in her world, she said quietly. I'm not going to let her down. Not again. Then she was gone, footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving Coulter alone in the nursery with his sleeping son and a dead wife's letter burning a hole in his pocket. The next 2 hours were the longest of Coulter's life. He moved through the house like a man in a dream, gathering supplies while trying not to look like he was preparing to run. Extra clothes for the baby, blankets, the small tin of condensed milk Evelyn had stored in the pantry, his rifle and ammunition, a knife, matches, everything he could carry without raising suspicion. Silas appeared twice during those 2 hours. The first time he knocked on Coulter's bedroom door and offered to watch the baby so Coulter could get some rest. Coulter declined, said he wanted to keep the child close after the scare with the fever. Silas's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, but he nodded and left. The second time, Coulter found him in the kitchen, making coffee. They sat at the table together, 2 men who'd worked side by side for years, drinking in silence while snow fell outside the window. Glad the baby pulled through, Silas said eventually. Would have been a real tragedy, losing him after everything else. Yeah. Coulter kept his voice neutral, his hands wrapped around the warm cup to stop them from shaking. Real tragedy. This midwife, Mercer, was it? She staying long? Just until she's sure the baby's stable. Where's she from? Didn't ask. Silas took a slow sip of coffee. Funny, a midwife showing up in a blizzard right when we need one. Almost like someone sent for her. Coulter met his foreman's eyes across the table. In that moment, he saw it. The calculation, the suspicion, the cold intelligence that had probably helped Silas get away with murder for years. Maybe we just got lucky, Coulter said. Maybe. Silas set his cup down and stood. Well, I'd better get back to work. Horses won't feed themselves. He left the kitchen, and Coulter sat alone in the silence, wondering if he'd just made a fatal mistake. Rowan was waiting at the north pasture gate when Coulter arrived, the baby bundled against his chest. She'd saddled 2 horses and loaded a pack mule with supplies, working fast and efficient in the pre-dawn darkness. "Any trouble?" she asked as Coulter approached. "Silas suspects something." Coulter handed her the baby while he checked his horse's saddle. "Kept asking questions about you. Wanted to know where you came from." "What did you tell him?" "As little as possible." Coulter took the baby back and secured him in a sling against his chest. "Did you find anything in his office?" Rowan's expression darkened. "A ledger. Names, dates, locations, all of them match up with infant deaths across the territory over the past 6 years. She patted her saddlebag. "I took it. If Silas didn't know we were running before, he sure as hell knows now. Then we'd better move." They rode hard through the darkness, pushing the horses as fast as they dared over snow-covered ground. The baby stayed quiet, soothed by the rhythm of the horse's gait and the warmth of Coulter's body. Behind them, Black Hollow Ranch disappeared into the storm. Coulter didn't look back. The line shack appeared just as dawn broke, a small, crude structure that looked like it might blow over in a strong wind, but had somehow survived decades of Montana winters. Coulter had spent many nights here during cattle drives, huddled around a fire with ranch hands, telling stories and sharing whiskey while snow piled up outside. Now, it felt like a fortress. They got the horses into the lean-to shelter and hauled the supplies inside. Rowan got the stove going while Coulter made a bed for the baby in a wooden crate lined with blankets. The child slept through it all, oblivious to the danger that had driven them from the only home he'd ever known. "He'll need to eat soon," Rowan said, organizing their food supplies on the rough wooden table. "How long since he nursed?" Coulter's chest tightened. "He hasn't. Not since Evelyn—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Rowan's expression softened slightly. "The condensed milk will work. I'll show you how to feed him." She did, patiently walking Coulter through the process of diluting the thick milk and getting the baby to take it from a clean cloth. It was messy and frustrating and took 3 times as long as it should have, but eventually the baby settled into it, sucking hungrily. "You're doing fine," Rowan said, watching from across the shack. "Better than most fathers would." "Evelyn always handled this part." Coulter's voice came out rough. "I didn't know the first thing about babies. Still don't." "You're learning. That's what matters." They fell into silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts, while the stove crackled and snow continued to fall outside. Coulter held his son and tried not to think about Evelyn, about how she should be here doing this instead of him, about how everything had gone so wrong so fast. "Can I ask you something?" he said eventually. Rowan looked up from the ledger she'd been studying. "What?" "How did you know Evelyn?" For a moment, Rowan didn't answer. She stared at the ledger like it might have the answer written somewhere in Silas's neat handwriting. "I didn't," she finally said. "Not really. We met by chance about a month ago. I was delivering a baby at a homestead near the Bitterroot Mountains, and she showed up asking questions about infant deaths in the area." Rowan's fingers traced the edge of the ledger. "Most people thought she was crazy, stirring up grief over children who'd died from natural causes. But I knew better. I'd seen the pattern. I just hadn't been able to prove it." "So you helped her?" "She helped me." Rowan met his eyes. "Gave me something I'd lost after my family died. Purpose. A reason to keep going that wasn't just survival." Coulter understood that. He'd been surviving for 3 weeks now, going through the motions, taking care of his son, running the ranch. But he hadn't really been living, just existing in the hollow space where Evelyn used to be. "What was she like?" Rowan asked. "Your wife." The question caught Coulter off guard. Nobody had asked him that since she disappeared. Everyone just offered condolences and awkward silences, like talking about Evelyn might somehow make things worse. "Strong," he said slowly. Stubborn as hell when she thought she was right about something. She grew up in Boston, came west with her family when she was 16. Her father thought she'd hate it out here, that she'd want to go back east and marry some banker or lawyer. Coulter smiled despite himself. Instead, she learned to ride better than most of the ranch hands, could shoot a rifle straight, and told her father she'd rather die than wear a corset ever again. Rowan's lips quirked. "I think I would have liked her." "She would have liked you too." Coulter shifted the baby to his shoulder, patting his back gently. Evelyn always said the best people were the ones who'd been broken and put themselves back together. Said they knew the value of things in ways comfortable people never could. She sounds wise. She was. Coulter's throat tightened. And now she's gone because she tried to save children she didn't even know, because she couldn't look the other way when babies were dying. That's not a bad way to die, Rowan said quietly. Dying for something that matters. Doesn't make it hurt any less. No, Rowan agreed. It doesn't. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the line shack. Coulter stood and walked to the window, looking out at the wall of white that had swallowed the world. Somewhere out there, Silas was probably organizing a search party, probably spinning some story about how Coulter had gone mad with grief and kidnapped his own child. "How long do you think we have?" he asked. Rowan joined him at the window. "Before Silas finds us? Could be hours, could be days. Depends on how hard the storm hits and how desperate he is. And then what? Then we make sure the truth gets out before he can kill us." Rowan held up the ledger. "This is proof. Names, dates, amounts of money changing hands. If we can get this to a territorial marshal, Silas goes to prison, maybe hangs. If we can get it to a marshal." "Yeah." Rowan's expression hardened. "If." The baby made a small sound against Coulter's shoulder, and both adults turned their attention to him instinctively. He'd finished eating and was starting to fuss, making the kinds of noises that usually meant he needed changing or just wanted to be held. "Here," Rowan said, reaching for him. "Let me take him for a while. You should eat something." Coulter hesitated, then handed the baby over. Rowan settled into the rocking chair near the stove with practiced ease, humming something low and soft that Coulter didn't recognize. The baby's fussing stopped almost immediately. "You're good with him," Coulter said. Rowan didn't look up. "I had practice." The words hung heavy with loss, and Coulter didn't push. Instead, he forced himself to eat some of the dried beef and hardtack they'd brought, washing it down with bitter coffee. The food tasted like ash, but he knew he needed to keep his strength up. They took turns sleeping after that, one always awake and watching while the other rested. Coulter didn't think he'd be able to sleep, but exhaustion dragged him under the moment his head hit the makeshift pillow. When he woke hours later, disoriented and stiff, the light through the window had shifted and Rowan was reading through the ledger again, her expression dark. "Find something?" he asked, sitting up. "Patterns?" Rowan turned a page carefully. "The deaths cluster around certain towns, certain months, and there are initials next to each entry. Different ones, but they repeat. Accomplices? Maybe. Or people paying for a service." Rowan's jaw tightened. "Some of these entries have notes. Healthy male, strong lungs, $50. Twin girls, weak constitution, $30 total." He was selling them, Coulter. Selling information about healthy babies to people who wanted them dead. Bile rose in Coulter's throat. Why would anyone want that? Inheritance, life insurance, unwanted children from affairs. Rowan's voice stayed flat, clinical, like she was reading a grocery list instead of a catalog of murdered infants. People kill for all kinds of reasons. Silas just made it easier and took a cut of the profits. Coulter thought about his own son, sleeping peacefully in the makeshift cradle. Someone had paid Silas to kill him. Someone had looked at that innocent child and decided he was worth more dead than alive. "Do you know who hired him?" Coulter asked. "For my son?" Rowan shook her head. "The entry just has initials, RC, and a note that says inheritance dispute, expedite. RC Coulter ran through everyone he knew with those initials. Came up blank. But someone out there wanted his son dead badly enough to pay for it, and they were still out there, still waiting. We need to find out who RC is," he said. "We will." Rowan closed the ledger. "But first we need to survive long enough to use this information." As if on cue, a sound cut through the howling wind outside. Horses. Coulter and Rowan locked eyes, and in that instant, the fragile safety of the line shack shattered. They moved together without speaking. Rowan grabbed the baby, Coulter grabbed his rifle. He positioned himself at the window while she pressed against the wall beside the door, one hand over the baby's mouth to keep him quiet. Through the snow-streaked glass, Coulter counted 3 riders approaching. They moved slowly, carefully, scanning the landscape like men hunting prey. The one in front wore a heavy coat that Coulter recognized immediately. Silas. "He brought help," Coulter whispered. "How many?" 3 total. Silas and 2 others I don't recognize. Rowan's expression went cold and calculating. Can you shoot from here? Not without them seeing the muzzle flash. They'll surround us. Then we need to be smart. Rowan looked around the small shack, taking inventory. 1 door, 2 windows, a stove, a table. Nothing that would stop bullets. When they knock, I'll answer. Play the midwife. You stay hidden with the baby. If shooting starts, run. I'm not leaving you here to... Someone has to get that baby and this ledger to safety. Rowan cut him off, her voice hard as stone. If that's you, so be it. If it's me, I'll do what needs doing. But one way or another, Silas doesn't get to walk away from this. Before Coulter could argue, a voice called out from the snow. Mr. Grayson, I know you're in there. We need to talk. Silas. His tone was friendly, concerned, exactly like it had been that morning in the kitchen. Like they were still employer and employee instead of hunter and prey. Rowan moved to the door, positioning herself so she'd be visible when it opened, but Coulter and the baby wouldn't be. She took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and called back. Mr. Grayson's not here, just me and the baby. A pause. Then, who are you? Rowan Mercer, the midwife. Another pause, longer this time. Coulter could almost hear Silas thinking, recalculating. Well, Miss Mercer, we're looking for Mr. Grayson. He left the ranch this morning without telling anyone where he was going. We're worried about him. Haven't seen him, Rowan lied smoothly. He left the baby with me at the ranch, said he had business to attend to. That's strange. His horse is in the lean-to out back. Rowan didn't miss a beat. He lent it to me, said I'd need it to get back to town after the storm passed. Silence. The kind that meant Silas didn't believe a word she was saying but was trying to decide how to play it. Then, mind if we come in? Just to warm up for a minute. It's cold as hell out here. Rowan looked at Coulter. He shook his head firmly. Letting them inside would end this before it started. But Rowan's expression said they didn't have a choice. If she refused, Silas would know for certain something was wrong. Just you, she called out. Your friends can stay with the horses. Another pause. Fair enough. Footsteps crunched through snow, getting closer. Coulter moved silently to the side of the door, rifle raised. The baby made a small sound, and Rowan shifted him against her shoulder, one hand subtly covering his mouth again. The door opened. Silas stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. He looked around the small shack with sharp, assessing eyes, taking in every detail. The stove, the supplies, the makeshift cradle, Rowan standing calm and composed with the baby in her arms. Cozy, he said. Functional. Rowan's voice stayed neutral. What do you really want, Mr. Creed? Silas smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. I want to know where Coulter Grayson is, and I want to know why you stole my ledger. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. I don't know what you're talking about, Rowan said. Don't you? Silas's hand moved toward his coat, and Coulter swung the rifle around, barrel pointed directly at the foreman's chest. Don't. Silas froze, then slowly raised his hands, that same empty smile still on his face. Well, I guess we're done pretending. Yeah, Coulter said, stepping fully into view. We are. The silence stretched tight as wire between the 3 of them. Outside, wind rattled the walls of the lined shack, and somewhere in the distance one of the horses whinnied. Silas stood with his hands raised, that practiced smile still plastered on his face like a mask he'd worn so long he'd forgotten what his real expression looked like underneath. This doesn't have to get messy, Silas said, his tone reasonable, almost friendly. Just give me the ledger and the baby, and I'll make sure you both walk away from this. Coulter's grip tightened on the rifle. You really think I'm that stupid? I think you're a grieving man who's not thinking clearly. Silas's eyes flicked to Rowan, then back to Coulter. This woman shows up out of nowhere with wild stories about murder and conspiracy, and suddenly you're running off into a blizzard with your sick child. That doesn't sound like the Coulter Grayson I've worked with for 8 years. Yeah, well, the Silas Creed I thought I knew wouldn't have tried to suffocate an infant in his sleep. Something flickered across Silas's face, annoyance maybe, or calculation. The smile slipped just a fraction. That baby was dying anyway, he said, voice dropping the friendly pretense. Weak lungs, just like his mother said. I was doing you a mercy, helping him pass peaceful instead of struggling for months. Evelyn never said that. Coulter's voice came out raw. She knew he was healthy. That's why she started asking questions. That's why you had her killed.
I didn't kill your wife. Silas lowered his hand slightly, testing whether Coulter would actually pull the trigger. She got herself killed by sticking her nose where it didn't belong. All I did was protect my business interests. Your business interests? Rowan's voice cut like broken glass. You mean the money you made selling information to people who wanted babies dead?
Silas looked at her properly for the first time, really looked, and something changed in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or respect for a worthy opponent. You're the woman who killed my associates in the mountains, he said. Marcus told me about you before he died. Said you shot him off his horse before he even saw you coming. He shouldn't have ambushed a grieving woman. Rowan shifted the baby slightly, keeping him close. And he definitely shouldn't have been slow on the draw. Fair enough. Silas's hand moved slowly toward his coat again. So here's where we stand. I've got 2 armed men outside who'll come running the second they hear gunfire. You've got 1 rifle, 1 woman, and 1 baby who can't exactly run for cover. The math doesn't work in your favor. Maybe not. Coulter's finger moved to the trigger. But I can damn sure make sure you don't walk out of here. You could. Silas nodded thoughtfully. But then my men kill the woman and take the baby anyway, and all you've accomplished is dying for nothing. That really what Evelyn would want? The words hit like a physical blow. Coulter's hands shook, and for a moment he saw it, saw himself pulling the trigger, saw Silas drop, saw the door burst open and bullets flying, and Rowan falling, and his son screaming, and everything ending in blood and smoke and failure. Evelyn wouldn't want that. But she wouldn't want him to give up either. Counteroffer, Rowan said before Coulter could respond. You walk out that door right now, ride back to Black Hollow Ranch, and we'll give you a 6-hour head start before we take that ledger to the territorial marshal. Silas actually laughed. Why the hell would I do that? Because the alternative is a shootout where at least one of us survives to tell the truth, Rowan said flatly. And even if we all die, I've already sent a copy of that ledger to someone who will make sure it reaches the right people. You're done, Creed. The only question is whether you die here or in front of a judge. It was a bluff. Had to be. Rowan hadn't had time to make a copy, let alone send it anywhere. But she delivered the lie with such perfect conviction that even Coulter almost believed her. Silas studied her face, looking for cracks in the story. Found none. You're lying, he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Am I? Rowan smiled, cold and sharp. You want to bet your life on it? The standoff stretched out, seconds feeling like hours. Through the window, Coulter could see the other 2 men shifting restlessly near their horses, hands hovering near their gun belts. They hadn't heard anything yet, but they were getting suspicious. Then Silas did something unexpected. He laughed again, but this time it sounded genuine. Almost impressed. You know what? I believe you. He lowered his hands completely, spreading them in a gesture of surrender. You've got me. The righteous crusader and the grieving widow, bringing down the evil businessman. It's a good story. People will eat it up. Then we're done here, Coulter said. Not quite. Silas's expression hardened. See, here's what you don't understand. That ledger, it doesn't just have my name in it. It's got names of every person who hired me over the past 6 years. Judges, lawyers, bankers, even a territorial senator. You really think they're going to let that information go public? Rowan went very still. What are you saying? I'm saying that ledger is worth more to certain people than my life is. Silas's smile returned, uglier now. You take it to a marshal, and maybe I hang. But you'll be dead within a week, and so will anyone you told. These aren't small-time criminals we're talking about. These are people with power, money, and a very strong motivation to make sure their names stay buried. So what? Coulter's voice came out hoarse. We just let you walk? Pretend none of this happened? I'm saying you've got a choice to make. Silas moved toward the door slowly, hands still visible. Keep fighting a war you can't win, or take what's left of your family and disappear. Start over somewhere nobody knows your name. Raise your son in peace, while you keep killing babies, while I keep doing business. Silas reached for the door handle. Think about it, Grayson. Your wife died trying to stop me, and where did it get her? 6 feet under in frozen ground. You want to join her, be my guest. But that baby deserves better than 2 dead parents and a grave marker. He pulled the door open, cold wind rushing in. I'll give you until morning to decide, Silas said. After that, I'm coming back with enough men to burn this shack to the ground. Ledger or no ledger. Choose wisely." Then he was gone, walking back to his horse while Coulter's fingers still hovered over the trigger, unable to pull it, unable to stop him. The door slammed shut. Coulter stood frozen, rifle still raised, breath coming in short gasps. He heard Silas mount up, heard the three horses ride away into the storm, and he didn't move. Couldn't move. His entire body felt locked in place, paralyzed by the weight of the choice Silas had just dropped in his lap. "Coulter?" Rowan's voice cut through the fog in his head. "Coulter, put the rifle down." He did, mechanically, setting it on the table. His hands were shaking so badly the gun rattled against the wood. "I should have shot him," Coulter said. "I had him right there, and I should have—" "And gotten us all killed." Rowan moved to the window, watching the riders disappear into white nothingness. He was right about the men outside. We wouldn't have made it. "So what? We just give up?" Coulter slammed his fist on the table, making the rifle jump. "Let him walk away after everything he's done?" "No." Rowan turned from the window, her expression hard and certain. "We get smart." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means we stop thinking like victims and start thinking like hunters." Rowan crossed to where the ledger sat and picked it up, flipping through pages with practiced efficiency. "Silas is right about one thing. The people named in here have power, but power comes with exposure. The more important they are, the more they have to lose if the truth comes out." Coulter tried to follow her logic through the haze of anger and fear clouding his mind. "So we use the ledger as leverage?" "Not exactly." Rowan stopped on a page near the middle, her finger tracing a line of text. "We find the one person in here who's vulnerable enough to turn on the others. Someone who made a mistake, who's desperate, who might trade testimony for immunity. RC, the initials from his son's entry. The person who wanted my boy dead." "Maybe." Rowan flipped to another page, then another. "There's a pattern here. Most of the entries are one-time transactions, but a few names repeat. Someone with the initials JM shows up 6 times over 3 years, and there's another, TB, 4 times in 18 months. Repeat customers, or someone with multiple problems to solve." Rowan set the ledger down. "Either way, these are people who've invested heavily in keeping Silas's operation running, which means they're also the most vulnerable if it falls apart." Coulter's mind started working again, cutting through panic to find strategy. "We find one of them, convince them to testify against Silas and the others. If we can identify them, yeah." Rowan rubbed her eyes, exhaustion showing through for the first time since she'd arrived at Black Hollow Ranch. "But that's going to take time we might not have. Silas said morning, and I believe him." The baby made a sound from the cradle, a small whimper that said he'd be awake and hungry soon. Coulter moved to him automatically, checking to make sure he was warm enough, that his breathing sounded right. The simple normal action helped ground him, pulling him back from the edge of panic. "There's someone else we could ask," Coulter said slowly. "About the initials." "Who?" "Doc Brennan. He's been practicing medicine in Copperfield for 20 years, delivers most of the babies within 50 miles. If anyone would know about suspicious infant deaths, it'd be him." Rowan considered this. "How far is Copperfield?" 12 miles south. Hard ride in this weather, but possible." Coulter picked up the baby, who was definitely awake now and starting to fuss. "Doc's a good man, honest. If we show him the ledger, he might be able to connect names to cases. And if he's one of the names in it?" The possibility hit Coulter like cold water. He'd known Doc Brennan his whole life. The man had delivered him, had set his broken arm when he was 12, had been there when Coulter's father died. But then again, Coulter would have sworn Silas was trustworthy too, right up until he wasn't. "We'll be careful," Coulter said, hearing how weak it sounded. Rowan didn't call him on it. Instead, she moved to the stove and started preparing more diluted milk for the baby. "If we go to Copperfield, we go smart. Scout the doctor's house first. Make sure Silas hasn't gotten there ahead of us. And we keep the ledger hidden until we're sure we can trust him." Agreed. They spent the next hour preparing for the journey. Rowan packed fresh supplies while Coulter fed the baby and checked their ammunition. The storm outside had settled into steady snowfall, which was both blessing and curse, easier to travel through, but also easier for Silas's men to track them. "Tell me about your children," Coulter said while they worked. The words came out before he'd really thought them through. But once they were out there, he didn't take them back. Rowan's hand stilled on the supply pack. For a long moment, she didn't respond, and Coulter thought maybe he'd pushed too far. Then she started moving again, slower now. Thomas was 6, she said quietly. Smart as a whip, always asking questions about how things worked. Mary was 4, sweet and quiet, loved to sing, and Sarah was only 8 months old when the fever came. I'm sorry. Everyone says that. Rowan tied off the pack with sharp, precise movements. Nobody knows what else to say, so they say sorry like it'll make a difference, like it'll bring them back. What should they say? Rowan looked up at him, and for the first time since they'd met, her guard dropped completely. Coulter saw the grief underneath, raw and vast and still bleeding even after 4 years. Nothing, she said. There's nothing to say. My children are dead, my husband is dead, and no amount of words changes that. What matters is what you do after. What did you do? Survived. Kept delivering babies because I couldn't save my own. Rode from town to town helping other families while trying not to hate them for still having what I lost. She picked up the pack and hefted it onto her shoulder. Then your wife gave me something better than sympathy. She gave me a purpose, a way to make the death of my family mean something. Stopping Silas. Stopping men like Silas. Rowan's expression hardened again, the vulnerability disappearing behind familiar walls. Making sure other mothers don't have to bury children who didn't have to die. Coulter looked down at his son, sleeping peacefully in his arms, despite everything happening around him. The baby had no idea how many people had already died trying to keep him safe. No idea that his own mother was gone, or that strangers wanted him dead for reasons that had nothing to do with who he was and everything to do with money and greed. He's going to grow up without her, Coulter said, without knowing her laugh, or the way she hummed while she cooked, or how she could calm a spooked horse just by talking to it. But he'll grow up knowing she loved him enough to die protecting him. Rowan moved toward the door. That counts for something. Did it? Coulter wanted to believe that, but belief felt like a luxury he couldn't afford right now. What he could afford was action, getting his son to safety, bringing down the men who'd killed Evelyn, making sure her death meant something beyond just another grave in frozen ground. They rode out as dusk settled over the mountains, turning the world into shades of gray and white. Coulter kept the baby bundled against his chest, tucked inside his coat where body heat and layers of wool created a warm pocket. The child slept through most of the journey, worn out from the day's disruptions. Rowan led the way, navigating by landmarks that were barely visible through the snow. She rode like someone who'd spent years in the saddle, comfortable and confident, even in conditions that would have had most people turned around within a mile. Coulter followed, trusting her instincts more than his own right now. They were maybe 5 miles from Copperfield when Rowan raised a hand, signaling a stop. Coulter pulled his horse up beside hers, scanning the landscape for whatever had caught her attention. What is it? Smoke. Rowan pointed toward a thin column of gray rising against the white sky, barely visible but definitely there. Coming from the direction of town. Could be someone's chimney. Could be. But Rowan's tone said she didn't believe it. Or could be Silas got there first. They approached carefully, leaving the horses tied in a stand of trees about a mile out, and continuing on foot. The baby woke up halfway there and started to fuss, and Rowan produced a strip of cloth soaked in sugar water for him to suck on. It worked, keeping him quiet while they crept closer to town. Copperfield was small, maybe 30 buildings total, clustered around a main street that served miners and ranchers from the surrounding territory. Doc Brennan's house sat on the edge of town, a neat 2-story structure with a shingle hanging out front that read, Medical Services, All Hours. The smoke was coming from his barn, or what was left of it. The structure was fully engulfed, flames punching through the roof and sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. A bucket brigade had formed, townspeople passing water from the well in a futile attempt to save the building. Nobody was trying very hard, though. The barn was already lost, and everyone knew it. Doc Brennan stood apart from the crowd, staring at the flames with an expression Coulter recognized. He'd seen it in his own mirror after Evelyn disappeared. The look of a man watching his world burn and not knowing how to stop it. Stay here, Coulter whispered to Rowan. Keep the baby quiet. What are you doing? Finding out if the doc's still on our side. Before she could argue, Coulter slipped through the shadows toward where Brennan stood. He approached from behind, keeping his voice low. Doc, it's Coulter Grayson. Brennan spun around, eyes wide with something that looked like fear. He was in his 60s, gray-haired and stoop-shouldered, with hands that shook as he grabbed Coulter's arm. "You need to leave," he hissed. "Right now. They're looking for you." "Who?" "Silas and 4 armed men. They came through here 2 hours ago, asking if anyone had seen you or a woman traveling with a baby." Brennan's grip tightened. "I told them no, but they didn't believe me. Said if I was lying, they'd burn my barn as a warning. If you were here, they'd burn my house with my wife inside." Coulter's stomach dropped. "Did you tell them anything?" "There was nothing to tell. I haven't seen you since Evelyn's funeral." Brennan glanced nervously at the crowd around the burning barn. "But they torched it anyway. Said it was a message to anyone thinking about helping you." "I'm sorry, Doc." "Sorry doesn't rebuild a barn." Brennan released Coulter's arm and stepped back. "What the hell did you do to make Silas Creed this angry?" "Found out he's been murdering babies for profit." The words hung between them while the barn collapsed inward with a crash that sent embers shooting into the night sky. Brennan's face went pale, then gray, then something approaching sick. "That's not possible," he whispered. "It is, and I can prove it." Coulter pulled the ledger from inside his coat, just far enough for Brennan to see the cover. "Names, dates, payments, 6 years of transactions. Your name in here, Doc?" "What? No, I would never—" Brennan reached for the ledger, but Coulter pulled it back. "I need to know I can trust you. Coulter, I delivered you. I held you when you were no bigger than your son is now. I watched you grow up, marry Evelyn, start a family." Brennan's voice cracked. "If you can't trust me, who can you trust?" Fair point. But Evelyn had trusted Silas too, and look where that got her. "There are initials in here," Coulter said. "RC. Someone who wanted my son dead. Do you know anyone with those initials who might have reason to want my family gone?" Brennan thought for a moment, his brow furrowed. Then his expression changed. Recognition, followed immediately by dread. "Raymond Calhoun," he said quietly. The name meant nothing to Coulter. "Who's that?" "Evelyn's uncle, her father's brother." Brennan glanced around to make sure nobody was listening. "He lives in Helena, runs a mining operation. Made a fortune in silver about 10 years back." Coulter's mind raced. "Evelyn never mentioned an uncle. They had a falling out before you met her. Something about her father's will, I think. Raymond believed he should have inherited the family money instead of Evelyn's father, and when her parents died, he tried to contest their estate." Brennan lowered his voice even further. "Evelyn inherited everything when her father passed, a substantial amount from what I heard. And with her gone, it would go to our son." Coulter's blood ran cold. "And if our son died before coming of age, the estate would revert to the next closest relative." "Raymond Calhoun." Brennan nodded grimly. "He's been trying to get his hands on that money for 20 years. With Evelyn dead and your son an infant with no other family, he'd have a strong legal claim." Everything suddenly made terrible sense. The timing of the attacks on his son, the desperation behind it. Raymond Calhoun wasn't just greedy, he was running out of time. The longer the baby survived, the harder it would be to challenge the inheritance. "Where can I find him?" Coulter asked. "Helena's 3 days' ride north, but Coulter—" Brennan grabbed his arm again. "This man has money and connections. If he hired Silas, he's not going to stop just because you know his name. You need to go to the territorial marshal." "With what proof? The ledger?" Coulter shook his head. "Silas was right. Half the names in here are powerful men who'll do anything to keep this quiet. I need Calhoun to confess. Need him to testify that he hired Silas, that this goes deeper than one corrupt foreman. He'll never do that." "He will if I give him the right motivation." Brennan's expression turned fearful. "You're talking about revenge, not justice." "I'm talking about keeping my son alive." Coulter stepped back, tucking the ledger away again. "Thanks for the information, Doc. And I really am sorry about the barn." He turned to leave, but Brennan called after him. "Coulter, wait." Coulter paused. "There's something else you should know," Brennan said heavily, "about Evelyn's death." Every muscle in Coulter's body went rigid. "What about it?" "The men who killed her, the ones Silas sent, they didn't just ambush her in the mountains." Brennan's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They tortured her first, trying to find out what she knew, who she'd told. She didn't break, didn't give them anything, but they made sure she suffered before they killed her. The world tilted sideways. Coulter felt like he'd been gut-punched, all the air leaving his lungs in a single horrible rush. He'd spent 3 weeks imagining how Evelyn died, quick, hopefully, a bullet or a fall from her horse. Something fast enough that she didn't have time to be scared. He'd been wrong. She'd been terrified, in pain, alone in frozen mountains with men who wanted her to betray everything she'd fought for, and she hadn't broken. How do you know this? The question came out strangled. Rowan Mercer told me. Brennan met his eyes. She came through Copperfield on her way to your ranch, stopped to get medical supplies, told me what happened, said Evelyn's last words were about protecting her son and making sure her death meant something. Coulter couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The image of Evelyn, strong, stubborn, fearless Evelyn, dying in agony while refusing to give up her son's location was too much to process. She loved that boy more than her own life, Brennan said quietly. Don't waste what she gave for him. Coulter nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He walked back toward where he'd left Rowan, moving on autopilot while his mind struggled to absorb what he'd just learned. Rowan was exactly where he'd left her, crouched in shadows with the baby sleeping against her shoulder. She took one look at his face and knew something had changed. What happened? Raymond Calhoun. Coulter's voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. Evelyn's uncle. He's RC. He hired Silas to kill our son so he could inherit her family's estate. Rowan's expression went hard as stone. Where is he? Helena, 3 days north. Then that's where we're going. Rowan... Coulter stopped, not sure what he was trying to say. Doc Brennan told me what they did to Evelyn, before they killed her. Rowan went very still. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but edged with something dangerous. I know. You were there. I was too late to stop it. She looked down at the sleeping baby. But I made damn sure they paid for it. All 3 of them. Coulter believed her. He could see it in her eyes, the memory of violence, the absence of regret. Rowan Mercer had killed 3 men in cold blood, and the only thing she felt about it was satisfaction that they'd suffered before they died. Good, Coulter said, and meant it. They retrieved their horses and rode through the night, putting distance between themselves and Copperfield. The baby slept through most of it, wrapped warm and secure against Coulter's chest. Around midnight, they stopped in an abandoned miner's cabin, one Coulter had used before during summer cattle drives. Rowan got a fire going while Coulter fed the baby. Neither of them spoke much, both lost in their own thoughts. The warmth from the stove and exhaustion from 2 days of running finally caught up with Coulter, and he felt himself starting to drift. Sleep, Rowan said from across the cabin. I'll keep watch. You need rest too. I'll sleep after you wake up. We'll trade off. Coulter wanted to argue, but his body made the decision for him. He lay down on one of the narrow bunks with the baby tucked securely beside him, and sleep pulled him under like a riptide. He dreamed of Evelyn. Not the Evelyn who'd died in the mountains, but the one who'd lived at Black Hollow Ranch. The one who sang while she cooked breakfast, who could outride most of the ranch hands, who'd kissed him goodnight every evening like they had all the time in the world. In the dream, she stood in the nursery, rocking their son and humming a lullaby Coulter didn't recognize. When she looked up and saw him watching, she smiled. You have to let me go, she said. I don't know how. Yes, you do. She set the baby in his cradle and crossed to Coulter, placing one hand against his chest over his heart. You do it by living, by protecting our son, by trusting people who want to help you. Like Rowan? Especially like Rowan. Evelyn's smile turned sad. She's been dead inside for 4 years, Coulter, punishing herself for failing her family. Don't let her keep punishing herself for failing ours, too. I won't. And don't let grief make you stupid. Her hand pressed harder against his chest. Raymond Calhoun is dangerous. Going after him angry is going to get you killed. Then what should I do? What you've always done. Evelyn stepped back. Be smart. Be patient. And when the moment comes, be ruthless. She started to fade, the dream dissolving around her. Evelyn, wait. I love you, she said as she disappeared. Take care of our boy. Coulter woke with tears on his face and dawn light streaming through the cabin's single grimy window. The baby was awake beside him, making small sounds but not crying yet. Across the room, Rowan sat at the table with the ledger open in front of her, studying it by firelight. "Bad dreams?" she asked without looking up. "Something like that." Coulter sat up, wiping his face with his sleeve. "You didn't sleep. Couldn't." Rowan turned a page. "Been reading through this, trying to piece together how the operation worked." "And?" "It's bigger than we thought." She looked up at him, and Coulter saw exhaustion written in every line of her face. Silas didn't just facilitate murders. He ran a whole network. People who identified vulnerable babies, people who created opportunities, people who covered up the deaths afterward. This wasn't one corrupt foreman. This was an organized system. Coulter felt sick. How many people involved? At least 20 that I can identify from the initials and notes. Maybe more. Rowan closed the ledger. If we bring this down, we're not just targeting Silas and Raymond Calhoun. We're targeting powerful people across the entire territory. Which means they'll come after us with everything they've got. Yes. The baby made a louder sound, demanding attention. Coulter picked him up and started the familiar process of preparing his morning feeding. His hands moved automatically while his mind worked through the impossible math of their situation. 2 people. 1 baby. No money. No allies they could trust completely. Up against at least 20 powerful men who'd already proven they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. "We're going to die, aren't we?" he said quietly. Rowan didn't answer immediately. She stood and crossed to the window, looking out at snow-covered mountains painted pink and gold by dawn light. "Maybe," she finally said. "Probably, even. But we'll die fighting, and maybe that's enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough to make sure someone else finishes what we started." Rowan turned to face him. "You asked me earlier what people should say instead of 'I'm sorry' when someone dies. You want to know the real answer?" "What?" "Nothing. They should say nothing and do everything." Her eyes met his. "Words don't matter. Action does. So if we die taking down Raymond Calhoun and dragging this conspiracy into daylight, that's a better legacy than living quiet and letting evil keep winning." Coulter looked down at his son, who was eagerly sucking milk from the cloth, oblivious to the conversation happening around him. This tiny person who'd never asked to be born into violence and loss, who deserved a chance to grow up safe, to know his mother's name, to have a life that meant something beyond just being another victim. "I'm not ready to die yet," Coulter said. "Good." Rowan's expression hardened with something that might have been respect. "Then let's make sure we don't." They left the cabin before the sun cleared the mountains, pushing north through terrain that got meaner with every mile. The trail to Helena cut through high country where winter hadn't just arrived. It had moved in and claimed ownership. Snow reached past the horses' knees in places, and the wind came at them sideways, carrying ice that felt like needles against exposed skin. The baby handled it better than Coulter expected. Tucked inside layers of wool and oilcloth against Coulter's chest, the child seemed content with the rhythm of the horse's movement and the warmth of his father's body. He cried when he was hungry, slept when he wasn't, and otherwise existed in that simple space infants occupied where the world's problems hadn't reached him yet. Coulter envied that simplicity. "We need a plan," Rowan said around midday when they stopped to rest the horses and let Coulter feed the baby. "Can't just ride up to Raymond Calhoun's front door and accuse him of murder." "Why not?" Coulter adjusted the cloth the baby was sucking on, making sure the milk mixture was flowing properly. "Worked with Silas." Silas was alone in a line shack. Calhoun's going to be in Helena, surrounded by people, probably in a house with staff and security. Rowan crouched beside a thin stream that somehow hadn't frozen solid yet, breaking through ice to fill their canteens. "We need leverage before we confront him." "The ledger's not enough?" "The ledger proves Silas took money from someone with the initials RC. It doesn't prove that's Raymond Calhoun, and it definitely doesn't prove he knew what he was paying for." Rowan stood, wiping ice from her gloves. Good lawyer could claim he hired Silas for legitimate ranch consultation or some other excuse. "We need more." Coulter knew she was right, but the knowledge sat bitter in his chest. They'd ridden 2 days through hell carrying proof of conspiracy and murder, and it still might not be enough to bring down the man who'd wanted his son dead.
What kind of leverage? He asked. A confession, or a witness who can tie Calhoun directly to the conspiracy. Rowan mounted her horse again. Someone who knows what was really happening and is willing to testify. Where do we find someone like that? Helena. Rowan kicked her horse forward. If Calhoun's been working with Silas for months or years, there'll be traces. People who noticed things. Servants who overheard conversations. Maybe even associates who got nervous when babies started dying. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than nothing. They rode in silence after that, each lost in thoughts too dark to share out loud. The mountains pressed in on both sides of the trail, and more than once Coulter caught himself scanning the ridgelines for movement, expecting to see Silas's men appear with rifles aimed. They didn't come. That worried Coulter more than if they had. Silas wasn't the type to give up, which meant he was either waiting for them in Helena or had decided to hit them somewhere between here and there. Either way, the absence of pursuit felt like a trap waiting to spring. Night caught them still, 15 miles short of Helena. They found shelter in an old trapper's lean-to that provided more psychological comfort than actual protection from the cold. Rowan got a fire going while Coulter changed the baby and tried not to think about how low their supplies were getting. The condensed milk would last maybe 2 more days if they stretched it. After that, he had no idea what they'd feed the child. "Tell me about Raymond Calhoun," Rowan said once they'd settled in for the night. "Everything you know." Coulter shifted the baby to his shoulder, patting his back to work out gas bubbles. "I don't know much. Evelyn never talked about him. I didn't even know he existed until Doc Brennan mentioned him." "But you knew about her family money." "Some. She inherited her parents' estate when they died, property in Boston, some investments, I think." Coulter frowned, trying to remember conversations from years ago that hadn't seemed important at the time. "She said it was tied up in trusts and legal arrangements, that we couldn't touch most of it until certain conditions were met." "What conditions?" "I don't know. She handled all that." Coulter felt a stab of guilt. He'd been content to let Evelyn manage the business side of their lives while he focused on running the ranch. Now he wished he'd paid more attention. "Why does it matter?" "Because if Raymond Calhoun went to the trouble of hiring Silas to murder your son, the inheritance must be substantial enough to justify the risk and expense." Rowan poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling up into darkness. "Men don't commit murder over pocket change. Whatever Evelyn inherited, it's worth killing for." The baby burped against Coulter's shoulder, a small wet sound that would have been funny under different circumstances. Coulter grabbed a cloth and wiped the spit up from his coat, adding it to the growing collection of stains that marked him as someone trying desperately to keep an infant alive in conditions no baby should have to endure. "What if we can't get a confession?" he asked. "What if we get to Helena and Calhoun just denies everything, and we can't prove he's lying?" Rowan was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had that flat, matter-of-fact tone that meant she'd already thought through the darkest possibilities and made her peace with them. "Then we make him disappear the same way he tried to make your son disappear," she said, quietly, permanently, in a way that sends a message to everyone else involved in this conspiracy. "That's murder. So is suffocating a baby." Rowan looked at him across the fire. "I'm not saying that's the plan. I'm saying it's an option if the legal route fails. You want to protect your son, sometimes you have to get your hands dirty." Coulter thought about Evelyn, about what she would say to that logic. She'd always believed in doing things the right way, following rules and laws even when they were inconvenient. But she'd also ridden into those mountains knowing she might not come back, willing to risk everything to stop men like Silas and Calhoun. Maybe there was a point where doing the right thing meant breaking the rules that protected evil people. "Let's try the legal way first," Coulter said. "But if it comes down to choosing between justice and keeping my son safe, I know which one I'm picking." Rowan nodded like that was the answer she'd expected. They settled into silence after that, taking turns sleeping while the other kept watch. The baby woke twice during the night, hungry and fussy, and both times Rowan took him without being asked, walking him around the small shelter while humming something low and tuneless that somehow soothed him back to sleep. Watching her rock his son in firelight, Coulter felt something shift in his chest. Not romantic, too soon for that, too raw, but something adjacent to trust. Something that acknowledged Rowan had become as invested in keeping this child alive as he was, and that maybe they weren't just allies of convenience anymore. Dawn came gray and cold,
bringing with it a wind that promised more snow before nightfall. They broke camp quickly, both of them feeling the pressure of time running out. Helena was close now, maybe 6 hours if the weather held and the trail stayed passable. They made it in 5. Helena sprawled across a valley like someone had dumped a box of buildings and let them settle where they landed. It was bigger than Coulter expected. Dozens of streets, hundreds of structures, church steeples, and commercial buildings mixed with residential houses and mining company offices. Smoke rose from what felt like 1,000 chimneys, creating a haze that hung over the town like fog. "We need to find out where Calhoun lives before we do anything else," Rowan said as they paused on a ridge overlooking the town. "And we need to do it without drawing attention." "I know someone here," Coulter said. "Used to work at Black Hollow Ranch before he moved to Helena to open a freight business. James Whitaker. If anyone knows the local gossip, it'd be him." "Can you trust him?" Coulter considered that. He'd trusted Silas too, right up until he couldn't. But James had been different, honest, straightforward, the kind of man who'd tell you the truth even when it hurt. Then again, Coulter's judgment of character had proven unreliable lately. "I think so," he said, which was the best he could offer. They entered Helena from the east side, keeping to less traveled streets where 2 riders with a baby wouldn't attract as much notice. Coulter kept his hat pulled low and his coat collar up, trying to make himself forgettable. Beside him, Rowan rode with the same practiced anonymity, just another frontier woman traveling through town. Whitaker's freight office sat near the edge of the commercial district, a sturdy building with W, Freight, and Supply painted across the front in letters that had seen better days. Coulter tied his horse outside and hesitated, one hand on the door. "Maybe you should stay out here," he said to Rowan. "With the baby. Less suspicious if it's just me. And if it's a trap, then you ride away and finish this without me." Rowan's expression said she didn't like that plan, but she didn't argue. Coulter handed her the baby. The child was awake but quiet, watching the world with dark eyes that reminded Coulter painfully of Evelyn, and stepped inside. The office smelled like sawdust and tobacco. James Whitaker stood behind a counter covered in manifests and shipping orders, arguing with a customer about delivery dates. He was a big man gone soft around the middle, with a beard that had more gray than Coulter remembered, and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He looked up when the door closed, and recognition hit his face like a punch. "Coulter Grayson." James set down the manifest he'd been holding. "Heard you were dead." "Heard wrong." Coulter moved to the counter, keeping his voice low. "I need information, James, about Raymond Calhoun." The customer, a thin man in an expensive coat, looked between them with open curiosity. James caught the look and jerked his head toward the door. "We're closed for lunch," he said to the customer. "Come back in an hour." The man started to protest, saw something in James's expression that changed his mind, and left. James waited until the door shut before coming around the counter and gripping Coulter's shoulder hard enough to hurt. "What the hell are you doing in Helena?" James kept his voice barely above a whisper. "Every lawman and hired gun in the territory is looking for you. Heard you kidnapped your own son, killed 2 ranch hands, and burned down half of Black Hollow Ranch." Coulter's stomach dropped. "That's a lie." "I figured. But that's the story Silas Creed is spreading." James released Coulter's shoulder and moved to the window, checking the street outside. "He's got warrants issued, rewards posted. Says you went mad with grief after your wife died and thinks everyone's trying to hurt your boy." "People are trying to hurt my boy." Coulter pulled out the ledger and set it on the counter. "Silas Creed has been running a murder-for-hire operation targeting infants. Raymond Calhoun paid him to kill my son so he could inherit Evelyn's family money. I can prove all of it." James stared at the ledger like it might bite him. "That's a hell of an accusation." "It's the truth." Coulter opened the book to the page with RC's initials. "Look, right here. Payment received, services rendered. Evelyn figured it out before she died. That's why she was killed in the mountains." James read the entry, his expression shifting from skepticism to horror. When he looked up, his face had gone pale. "Sweet Christ," he breathed. "How many?" "At least 11 that we know about, probably more." Coulter closed the ledger. "I need to know where Calhoun lives, who he associates with, anything that might help me get close to him. Getting close to Raymond Calhoun is suicide." James moved back behind his counter like the physical barrier might protect him from what Coulter was asking. "The man owns half the mining interests in this valley. He's got connections to territorial government, probably federal too. You can't just walk up and accuse him of conspiracy to murder. I'm not planning to accuse him. I'm planning to make him confess. How? Coulter didn't have a good answer for that. He glanced out the window to where Rowan waited with the baby, then back at James. One way or another, he said. Where does he live? James hesitated, wrestling with whatever internal debate was happening behind his eyes. Then he sighed and pulled out a piece of paper, sketching a rough map. North end of town, big estate with walls and gates, staff quarters, the works. James marked an X on the map. He doesn't go out much anymore. Bad health, from what I hear. Most of his business gets conducted through intermediaries. Who? Lawyers, mostly. There's one who handles a lot of his affairs, Thomas Burke. Office is downtown, 3 blocks from the courthouse. Thomas Burke. TB. The initials that appeared 4 times in Silas's ledger. Coulter felt pieces clicking together. This lawyer, he married? Have kids? James frowned at the question. No, bachelor. Keeps to himself mostly. Why? Because I think he's been helping facilitate these murders. Coulter tapped the ledger. And if he's that deep in it, he might be the weak link we can exploit. We? James looked toward the window again, finally noticing Rowan. Who's that? Someone helping me keep my son alive. Coulter folded the map and tucked it inside his coat. You going to turn me in, James? Should I? If you believe Silas's version of events, probably. Coulter met his old friend's eyes. But if you remember who I am, and who Evelyn was, you'll know I'm telling the truth. James was quiet for a long moment. Outside, voices passed by on the street, normal people going about normal lives, while Coulter's world balanced on the edge of a knife. I remember when you and Evelyn got married, James finally said. Remember how she looked at you like you hung the moon, and how you looked at her like she was the only thing in the world worth protecting. He pushed the map across the counter. I also remember she was too smart and too stubborn to let anyone hurt her family without a fight. If she died trying to stop this, least I can do is help you finish it. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. James grabbed Coulter's arm before he could leave. Whatever you're planning, do it fast. Silas's men arrived in Helena yesterday. They're staying at the Grand Hotel, asking questions, showing your picture around. You've got maybe a day before they find you. Coulter's blood went cold. They're already here? Been here since yesterday afternoon. James released his arm. Which means you need to do whatever you came to do and get out before they close the net. Coulter left the freight office with his mind racing. 1 day, maybe less. That's all the time they had to confront Raymond Calhoun, extract a confession, and somehow get that information to authorities who weren't already corrupted. Rowan read the urgency in his face the moment he stepped outside. What happened? Silas's men are in town. Been here since yesterday. Coulter took the baby from her and secured him back in the sling against his chest. We need to move now. Where? Thomas Burke's office. Calhoun's lawyer. Coulter showed her the map. If we can get to him before word spreads that we're here, maybe we can convince him to turn on Calhoun. And if he won't? Coulter's hand drifted to the knife on his belt. Then we find another way to make him talk. They left the horses at a livery stable on the edge of town, paying extra for the stableman to keep quiet about 2 strangers with a baby. Then they walked toward the commercial district, trying to blend into the afternoon foot traffic while staying alert for anyone who might recognize them. Thomas Burke's office occupied the 2nd floor of a brick building that also housed a bank and a tailor shop. The sign outside read, Burke and Associates Legal Services, in professional gold lettering that spoke of money and respectability. How do we do this? Rowan asked as they studied the building from across the street. Direct approach. Coulter adjusted the baby in his sling. Walk in like we have every right to be there, ask for a private consultation, and once we're alone with Burke, show him the ledger and give him a choice. What choice? Testify against Calhoun and the others, or we make sure everyone knows he's been facilitating infant murders for profit. Coulter's jaw tightened. His reputation will be destroyed either way, but at least testimony might keep him out of prison. It wasn't a great plan. Actually, it was barely a plan at all. But they were out of time and options, and sometimes all you could do was kick down the door and see what happened. They crossed the street and climbed the stairs to Burke's office. A secretary sat at a desk in the front room. Young woman, efficient-looking, with the kind of expression that said she'd perfected the art of turning away unwanted visitors. "Can I help you?" She barely looked up from the papers she was organizing. "We need to see Mr. Burke," Coulter said. "It's urgent. Mr. Burke doesn't take walk-in appointments. You'll need to schedule. It's about Raymond Calhoun and a matter of inheritance." Coulter let just enough desperation leak into his voice. "Please, it can't wait." The secretary's expression flickered, recognition of Calhoun's name maybe, or just professional courtesy towards someone who looked as worn down as Coulter felt. "One moment." She disappeared through a door behind her desk. Rowan moved closer to Coulter, her hand resting casually near the pistol hidden under her coat. "If this goes wrong, it won't. But if it does, then we fight our way out and try something else." Coulter shifted the baby, who was starting to fuss. "We've come too far to turn back now." The secretary returned. "Mr. Burke will see you, but he only has 15 minutes before his next appointment." They followed her through the door into a well-appointed office that spoke of success and careful cultivation of image. Law books lined shelves on one wall. Framed credentials covered another. A large desk dominated the center of the room, and behind it sat Thomas Burke. He was younger than Coulter expected, maybe 40, with dark hair starting to gray at the temples, and the kind of polished appearance that came from expensive tailors and careful grooming. His eyes were intelligent and calculating as they took in Coulter, Rowan, and the baby. "Mr. Burke, thank you for seeing us," Coulter started. "I know who you are." Burke's voice was smooth, educated, with no trace of frontier roughness. "Coulter Grayson, wanted for kidnapping and murder. And you must be Rowan Mercer, the midwife who's been helping him." The secretary gasped. Burke raised a hand without looking at her. "Close the door on your way out, Sarah, and hold all my appointments for the next hour." She fled. The door clicked shut. Burke leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled together. "So, either you're here to kill me, or you think I can help you somehow. Which is it?" Coulter set the ledger on Burke's desk. "I think you're in deep enough that helping us is your only way out alive." Burke's eyes flicked to the ledger, but he didn't reach for it. "Is that Silas Creed's record book?" "Yes." "And you think my initials appearing in it 4 times proves I was involved in conspiracy to murder infants?" "Were you?" Rowan asked bluntly. Burke was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, crossed to a cabinet, and pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 3 glasses. He poured generous amounts into each and pushed 2 across the desk toward Coulter and Rowan. "I'm a criminal defense attorney," Burke said, returning to his chair with his own glass. "I represent people accused of terrible things. Sometimes those people are actually innocent. More often, they're not. My job isn't to determine guilt or innocence. It's to ensure they receive competent legal representation." "That's not an answer," Coulter said. "No, it's not." Burke took a drink. "The answer is yes. I facilitated 4 contracts between clients and Silas Creed. 3 resulted in infant deaths. The 4th, your son, was still in progress when Mrs. Grayson started asking uncomfortable questions. The casual admission hit like a physical blow. Coulter had expected denials, deflection, legal double talk, not this cold acknowledgement of complicity. "Why?" The word came out strangled. "Money," initially. Burke swirled the whiskey in his glass. "Silas approached me 5 years ago with a proposition. He had clients who wanted problems solved discreetly, and he needed someone who could structure the arrangements in ways that couldn't be traced back to the parties involved. I provided that service for a significant fee." "You help people murder babies for money," Rowan said, her voice flat and dangerous. "I helped people solve succession problems and inheritance disputes." Burke met her eyes without flinching. "What Silas did with that money was between him and his conscience, not my concern." Coulter's hand moved toward his knife, but Rowan caught his wrist. "Don't. We need him." "For what?" "He just admitted to being exactly the kind of man who'll trade testimony for immunity." Rowan kept her eyes on Burke. "That's right, isn't it? You're not stupid enough to think this ends well for you unless you cooperate." Burke smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Mercer, I've been expecting something like this for 6 months. Ever since Mrs. Grayson started connecting dots between suspicious infant deaths and noticed the pattern, I knew eventually someone would come asking questions I couldn't deflect." "So testify," Coulter said. "Tell a judge everything you know about Calhoun and the others. Help us bring this whole operation down. And spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder waiting for someone to put a bullet in my head? Burke shook his head. Raymond Calhoun isn't the only powerful man whose name appears in that ledger. There are territorial officials, business leaders, even a federal judge. They won't let me live long enough to testify. Then what's the point of this conversation? Rowan asked. Burke opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick envelope. Because I have something better than testimony. Documentation. Every contract I structured, every payment I facilitated, every communication between clients and Silas, all of it carefully preserved as insurance in case things went exactly the way they're going now. He tossed the envelope onto the desk between them. Coulter stared at it like it might explode. Why would you keep evidence that incriminates you? Because evidence that incriminates me also incriminates people far more powerful than I am. Burke stood and moved to the window, looking down at the street below. I'm not a fool, Mr. Grayson. I knew this arrangement wouldn't last forever, so I made sure that if I went down, I wouldn't go down alone. Rowan picked up the envelope and looked inside. Her eyes widened slightly. These are signed contracts, correspondence on official letterhead, bank transfer records. Everything you need to connect every name in that ledger to specific acts of conspiracy and murder, Burke confirmed. Take it, use it, burn down the whole rotten structure if you can. In exchange for what? Coulter asked, because nothing came free. Safe passage out of Helena and enough time to disappear before Calhoun and the others realized what happened. Burke turned from the window. I have money saved in banks they don't know about, contacts in San Francisco who can provide new identity papers. Give me 12 hours and I'll vanish so thoroughly they'll never find me. While we're left holding evidence that makes us targets for every corrupt official in the territory, Rowan said, you were already targets the moment Mrs. Grayson started this investigation. Burke finished his whiskey and set the glass down with a click. At least now you have leverage. The baby made a sound against Coulter's chest, not crying, just an expression of general displeasure with the world. Coulter patted his back automatically while his mind raced through possibilities. Burke was offering them exactly what they needed. Proof that connected powerful men to conspiracy and murder. Evidence that could bring down not just Raymond Calhoun, but the entire network that had been killing children for profit. But accepting it meant trusting a man who'd just admitted to facilitating multiple murders. It meant letting him escape justice while they stayed behind to face the consequences. How do we know this is real? Coulter asked. That you're not just handing us forged documents while you run to warn Calhoun. You don't. Burke moved back to his desk and started gathering personal items. A photograph, some papers, a small wooden box. But consider this. If I wanted you dead, I could have had Silas's men waiting in this office instead of meeting with you myself. If I wanted to protect Calhoun and the others, I would have destroyed this evidence months ago instead of preserving it. Then why help us at all? Rowan demanded. Burke paused, holding the wooden box. For the first time since they'd entered his office, genuine emotion crossed his face. Regret, maybe, or something adjacent to shame. Because I have a daughter, he said quietly. 3 years old. Lives with her mother in Denver. We never married, complicated situation. And every time I look at her, I think about the children whose deaths I facilitated. Wonder if one of them would have grown up to be like her. Smart, curious, full of life. He set the box down and met Coulter's eyes. I can't undo what I've done, Burke continued. Can't bring those children back or absolve myself of guilt. But maybe I can stop it from happening to more families. Maybe that counts for something. The office fell silent except for street noise filtering up from below, and the baby's soft breathing against Coulter's chest. Coulter looked at Rowan, trying to read her thoughts. She was studying Burke with that same calculating expression she'd worn when deciding whether to trust Coulter back at Black Hollow Ranch. Finally, she nodded. 12 hours, Coulter said to Burke. Then we're taking this evidence to every newspaper and territorial marshal we can find. That's all I need. Burke finished packing his belongings into a leather bag. One more thing. Raymond Calhoun is hosting a dinner tonight at his estate. Half the territorial power structure will be there. If you want to confront him publicly, in front of witnesses who can't be silenced or bought off, that's your opportunity. How do we get in? Rowan asked. The guest list is extensive. Calhoun likes showing off his wealth and influence. Burke pulled out a piece of paper and wrote something on it. Use these names. Tell the staff you're expected. They won't verify with Calhoun directly. Too many guests, too much chaos. He handed the paper to Coulter, then shouldered his bag and moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. Mrs. Grayson was a remarkable woman, he said without turning around. She came to my office 3 weeks ago with questions about inheritance law. I lied to her face, sent her away with false reassurances that everything was legal and proper. She saw right through it, told me I'd have to live with what I'd done, and that she'd make sure the truth came out even if it killed her. Burke's shoulders sagged slightly. She was right on both counts, he said. I hope bringing down this conspiracy gives you some measure of peace, because it won't give me any. Then he was gone, footsteps echoing down the stairs, leaving Coulter and Rowan alone in an office that suddenly felt too quiet. Rowan opened the envelope again and spread its contents across Burke's desk. Contracts, letters, financial records. All of it damning, all of it precisely documented in the careful handwriting of a man who understood the value of insurance. This is it, she said softly. Everything we need. Coulter looked down at the evidence that could destroy Raymond Calhoun and everyone else involved in the conspiracy. Then he looked at his son, sleeping peacefully, despite being surrounded by documents cataloging the attempt on his life. Tonight, he said. We end this tonight. They spent the afternoon in a boarding house on the rough side of Helena, where questions weren't asked and nobody looked twice at strangers. Rowan cleaned up first, scrubbing away days of trail dust while Coulter watched the baby and studied Burke's documents by fading daylight. The evidence was damning in ways that made his hands shake. Correspondence between Calhoun and Silas discussing the Grayson problem, bank transfers timed to match deaths in the ledger, even a contract specifying payment schedules based on the infant's age at time of death. His son had been worth more dead at 6 months than at 3. The calculation was right there in black ink, spelled out like livestock pricing. Coulter felt bile rise in his throat. We can't bring the baby tonight, Rowan said, emerging from behind the privacy screen in a dress she'd purchased from a second-hand shop. It was dark blue, simple, but respectable enough for a dinner party. She looked uncomfortable in it, kept tugging at the neckline like the fabric was strangling her. I know. Coulter had been wrestling with that problem for the past hour. But we can't leave him alone either. There's a woman downstairs, landlady. She's got grandchildren, seemed competent. Rowan sat down and started working on her hair, trying to tame it into something presentable. I asked if she'd watch him for a few hours. Offered her $20. You think she's trustworthy? I think $20 is enough money that she'll make damn sure nothing happens to him while we're gone. Rowan gave up on the hair and left it pulled back in a severe bun. And I think we don't have better options. She was right, but that didn't make the decision easier. Coulter looked at his son, currently sleeping in a makeshift bed made from dresser drawers and blankets. The child had been through so much already, dragged across frozen mountains, nearly suffocated, hunted by men who wanted him dead. Now Coulter was planning to leave him with a stranger while he and Rowan walked into what might be a death trap. But what choice did they have? 2 hours, Coulter said. We go in, confront Calhoun in front of his guests, get him to confess or at least rattle him enough that he makes a mistake. Then we're out and back here before the baby even wakes up. And if things go wrong? Coulter met her eyes. Then you get the evidence to someone who can use it. Don't wait for me. Don't come back for me. Just make sure those documents reach people who'll publish them. Like hell. Rowan stood and crossed to where Coulter sat. We go in together, we come out together. That's how this works. Rowan, don't. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. I didn't ride through a blizzard and kill 3 men just to run away when things get dangerous. Whatever happens tonight, we face it together. Coulter wanted to argue, but the determination in her eyes told him it would be pointless. Rowan Mercer had made her decision, and nothing he said would change it. All right, he said, together. Coulter washed and changed into the only decent clothes he'd packed, dark trousers, a clean shirt, a coat that had seen better days but would pass in dim lighting. Looking at himself in the cracked mirror above the washstand, he barely recognized the man staring back. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, someone who'd aged years in the span of weeks. Evelyn wouldn't recognize him either. The thought came unbidden and hurt more than he expected. He pushed it away and focused on the immediate problem, getting into Raymond Calhoun's estate, confronting the man who'd tried to murder his son, and surviving long enough to see justice done. Simple. The landlady, a thick-waisted woman named Mrs. Chen, who spoke English with a heavy accent, came to collect the baby at 7. She clucked over him with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd raised multiple children and seen everything at least twice. "Beautiful boy," she said, settling him against her ample chest. "He sleep good. You come back, he be fine." Coulter handed over the $20 plus another 10 for good measure. "If anything happens, anything at all, you take him to the freight office on Commerce Street. Ask for James Whitaker. Tell him Coulter sent you." Mrs. Chen pocketed the money and nodded. "Nothing happened. I keep babies safe for 40 years. This one no different." She left with Coulter's son, and the room suddenly felt enormous and empty. Coulter stood frozen, fighting the urge to run after them and call the whole thing off. Rowan's hand found his. "He'll be safe," she said quietly. "We're doing this so he stays safe." "I know." They left the boarding house as darkness settled over Helena. Gas lamps flickered to life along the main streets, casting pools of yellow light across snow-packed roads. Carriages rattled past, carrying well-dressed people to evening engagements. The town felt alive in ways that made the frontier settlement seem like dying embers by comparison. Calhoun's estate sat at the north end of town, exactly where James's map had indicated. High walls surrounded the property, broken only by an iron gate that stood open to admit a steady stream of arriving guests. Light spilled from tall windows in the main house, and music drifted across the snow. A string quartet playing something classical that Evelyn would have recognized. Coulter's chest tightened at the thought. Names? A servant stood at the gate with a list, checking arrivals against expected guests. Rowan answered smoothly, using the names Burke had provided. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, we're expected." The servant scanned his list, found the names, and waved them through without a second glance. Just like that, they were inside Raymond Calhoun's fortress. The main house was everything Coulter expected from a man rich enough to hire assassins as casually as most people hired ranch hands. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, artwork that probably cost more than Black Hollow Ranch was worth. Servants in formal livery moved through rooms with practiced efficiency, offering champagne and small plates of food to guests who barely noticed them. Coulter felt like an intruder at a party where everyone else knew the rules he'd never learned. Beside him, Rowan moved with surprising confidence, accepting a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking and scanning the crowd with sharp eyes. "There." She nodded toward a group near the fireplace in the main parlor. Raymond Calhoun sat in a wheelchair surrounded by sycophants. He was older than Coulter expected, had to be pushing 70, with white hair and skin gone papery with age. But his eyes were sharp and calculating as they moved across his guests, and his voice carried authority when he spoke despite the physical frailty. This was the man who'd wanted Coulter's son dead. This withered creature in expensive clothes who'd paid Silas Creed to suffocate an infant so inheritance money would flow his direction instead. Rage burned hot in Coulter's chest. "Easy," Rowan murmured beside him. "We need him talking, not dead from a heart attack." She was right. Killing Calhoun would feel good for about 30 seconds. Then it would ruin everything. They needed him to confess, needed witnesses to hear it, needed the truth to come out in a way that couldn't be buried or denied. They circulated through the party for 20 minutes, listening to conversations and watching Calhoun hold court. The man was skilled at playing the gracious host, asking about people's families, their businesses, expressing concern and interest with the kind of practiced charm that came from decades of manipulation. Finally, during a lull in conversation, Coulter made his move. He crossed the parlor with Rowan at his side and stopped directly in front of Calhoun's wheelchair. The old man looked up, mild curiosity on his face. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Calhoun said. "You are?" "Coulter Grayson." He let the name hang in the air and watched recognition hit Calhoun's face like a slap. "Evelyn's husband. You remember Evelyn, don't you? Your niece who died 3 weeks ago?" The parlor went quiet. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as people turned to stare at the confrontation developing in front of them. Calhoun's expression shifted through several emotions too fast to track before settling on confused concern. "Mr. Grayson, of course. I heard about the tragedy." His voice oozed sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Evelyn was a remarkable woman. Remarkable enough that you tried to have her son murdered so you could steal her inheritance."
Gasps rippled through the room. Calhoun's face went red, then pale. A man beside him, lawyer probably, from the expensive suit and calculating expression, stepped forward with hands raised. "Mr. Grayson, you're clearly distraught. Perhaps we should—" "Shut up." Rowan's voice cut like broken glass. "Unless you want everyone here to know you were complicit in conspiracy to murder." More gasps. The lawyer's mouth snapped shut. Calhoun wheeled his chair forward slightly, his expression hardening into something cold and dangerous. "I don't know what lies you've been told, but I would never harm Evelyn's child. He's my great-nephew, for heaven's sake. He's also the only thing standing between you and a fortune in inheritance money." Coulter pulled Burke's documents from inside his coat and held them up. Signed contracts, bank transfers, correspondence between you and Silas Creed discussing the best way to kill an infant without arousing suspicion. All of it documented, all of it traceable directly to you. That's preposterous. Those documents are obviously forged. But Calhoun's voice wavered slightly. His eyes flicked to the lawyer, who was staring at the papers with an expression that said he recognized them and knew they weren't forged. "Are they?" Rowan moved to Coulter's side. "Then you won't mind if we read some excerpts aloud. Let your guests decide for themselves." She took one of the letters and began reading in a clear, carrying voice that reached every corner of the now silent parlor. "The Grayson situation must be resolved before the child's first birthday. After that, legal challenges to the inheritance become significantly more complicated. Silas assures me his methods are undetectable and will appear as natural causes. Payment schedule as discussed, half upon contract signing, remainder upon successful completion." Rowan looked up. "It's dated 2 months after Evelyn gave birth. Signed by you, Raymond Calhoun, with your personal seal." The silence in the parlor felt like a physical weight. Guests stared at Calhoun with expressions ranging from horror to disgust. The lawyer had gone pale and was backing toward the door. "This is slander!" Calhoun's voice rose, shaking with anger or fear. "I'll have you arrested, both of you. You break into my home, make wild accusations." "We have proof." Coulter stepped closer, close enough to see the fear in the old man's eyes despite his bluster. "Proof that you hired Silas Creed to murder my son. Proof that you paid for Evelyn's death when she started asking questions. Proof that you're part of a conspiracy that's been killing babies across this territory for years." "That's a lie." "Is it?" Rowan held up another document. "Because we also have a ledger showing payments from at least 20 different clients, all funneled through Thomas Burke's law office, all connected to suspicious infant deaths. Your name appears 6 times, Raymond. 6 different payments over 4 years. How many other people's children did you kill before you came after ours?" The parlor erupted. Guests shouted questions, demanded explanations. Several moved toward the door like being in the same room as Calhoun might contaminate them. The lawyer had disappeared entirely. Calhoun's face twisted with rage. "You have no idea what you're doing. The people involved in this, they won't let you walk out of here alive." "Then they'll have to kill us in front of 50 witnesses." Coulter raised his voice to carry over the chaos. "Everyone here heard what you just said, heard you threaten us instead of denying the accusations. That's as good as a confession." For a moment, Calhoun looked like he might have a stroke right there in his wheelchair. His hands gripped the armrest so tight his knuckles went white, and his breathing came in short, sharp gasps. Then his expression changed. The rage smoothed away, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You're right," he said quietly, and the admission shocked the room back into silence. "I won't deny it. Yes, I hired Silas Creed. Yes, I wanted Evelyn's son dead. And yes, I was involved in arranging the deaths of other infants when it served my interests or the interests of my associates." Coulter felt like the floor had tilted. He'd expected denials, deflection, attempts to explain away the evidence, not this casual admission of multiple murders. "Why?" The question came out hoarse. "Because money is power, Mr. Grayson, and power is all that matters in this world." Calhoun's voice was steady now, almost lecturing. "Evelyn's father stole my rightful inheritance decades ago. I've spent my entire life clawing back what should have been mine from the beginning. When Evelyn died, I saw an opportunity to finally reclaim it. Her son was an obstacle. I removed obstacles." "He's a baby." Coulter's hand shook with the effort of not lunging at the old man. "An innocent child who never did anything to you." "Innocence is irrelevant.
He stood between me and what was mine. Calhoun looked around at his guests, seeming to find the situation almost amusing now. You all understand that. You've all made compromises, bent rules, hurt people when necessary to protect your interests. Don't pretend otherwise. Several guests looked uncomfortable. A few slipped quietly toward the exits. The difference, Calhoun continued, is that I'm honest about it. I don't hide behind morality or pretend my hands are clean. I do what needs doing and accept the consequences. Then accept these. Rowan stepped forward and dropped the stack of documents on Calhoun's lap. Every person named in those papers will be exposed. Every death you facilitated will be investigated. And when the territorial marshal arrives, which should be any minute now, you'll be arrested for conspiracy to murder. Calhoun looked down at the documents, then back up at Rowan. He laughed, a dry sound like rustling paper. You really think a territorial marshal can touch me? I own 3 judges, 2 senators, and half the law enforcement in this territory. Those documents will disappear. Witnesses will recant, and you'll both be found dead in an alley somewhere, victims of a tragic robbery. Maybe. Coulter pulled out one more piece of paper, a letter he'd written that afternoon and left with James Whitaker. Or maybe copies of everything in those documents are already on their way to newspapers in Denver, San Francisco, and Washington. Maybe this story is going to be published whether you kill us or not. Maybe the best you can hope for now is a quick death before angry parents start showing up at your door. The color drained from Calhoun's face. You're bluffing, am I? Coulter met his eyes. You want to bet your life on it? For the first time since they'd arrived, Calhoun looked uncertain. His gaze darted around the parlor at guests who were no longer looking at him with respect, but with the kind of horror reserved for monsters. His hands trembled on the wheelchair's armrests. Then the front door burst open. Silas Creed strode into the parlor with 3 armed men behind him. His eyes found Coulter immediately, and something like satisfaction crossed his face. There you are, Silas said. Been looking all over Helena for you. The room erupted into chaos. Guests screamed and scrambled for exits. A woman fainted. Someone knocked over a champagne table, sending glass shattering across marble floors. Coulter's hand went to the pistol hidden under his coat, but Rowan grabbed his wrist. Too many people, she hissed. You start shooting in here, innocent guests die. She was right, but that didn't change the fact that Silas and his men were between them and any exit. They were trapped in a room full of panicking civilians with armed killers blocking the only way out. Silas seemed to realize this at the same time. He smiled, that practiced expression that had fooled Coulter for years. Nobody needs to get hurt, Silas called out over the chaos. Mr. Grayson and Miss Mercer just need to come with us quietly. Everyone else can leave. Guests didn't need to be told twice. They fled through side doors and windows, desperate to escape before bullets started flying. Within 90 seconds, the parlor had emptied except for Coulter, Rowan, Calhoun, Silas, and his 3 hired guns. Well, Silas's smile widened. This is convenient. Coulter kept his hand near his pistol, but didn't draw it. Not yet. You're too late, Silas. Everyone heard Calhoun confess. The evidence is already out there. Killing us won't stop what's coming. Maybe not, but it'll make me feel better. Silas pulled his own weapon, a long-barreled revolver that looked well-maintained and frequently used. Plus, Mr. Calhoun is paying me a substantial bonus to make sure you and that baby don't survive the week. The baby's not here, Rowan said. I know. We checked the boarding house first. Silas's expression turned cruel. Shame about that landlady, by the way. She put up quite a fight. Coulter's world tilted sideways. What did you do? What I had to. And don't worry, we didn't hurt the baby. Yet. He's waiting for you back at the boarding house, right where you left him. Except now we have him, and you don't. Rage and terror crashed over Coulter in equal measure. Mrs. Chen was dead. His son was in the hands of Silas's men. Every sacrifice, every risk, every mile they'd ridden to keep that child safe had just been undone. You're lying, he said, but his voice shook. Am I? Silas tilted his head. Guess there's one way to find out. Put down your weapons and come quietly. Maybe I'll let you see your boy one more time before I finish this. Or maybe you're full of shit. Rowan's voice was steady, cold. Maybe you didn't find the baby at all, and you're trying to bluff us into surrendering. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle of cloth. He tossed it to the floor between them. Coulter's heart stopped.
It was the baby's blanket. The one Evelyn had made before he was born, embroidered with his initials in thread she'd dyed herself, stained now with what looked like blood.
Still think I'm bluffing? Silas asked. The world narrowed to that blood-stained blanket on the marble floor. Coulter felt something break inside him, not just hope, but the fragile structure that had been holding him together since Evelyn's death. His son was gone, taken by the same man who'd tried to suffocate him, who'd killed his mother, who'd destroyed everything Coulter loved, and there was nothing left to lose. Coulter drew his pistol. Everything happened at once. Rowan drew too, faster than Coulter would have thought possible. Silas's men raised their weapons. Calhoun wheeled his chair backward, trying to get clear. And someone Coulter hadn't noticed, a servant who'd been hiding behind an overturned table, suddenly stood up and fired a shotgun into the ceiling. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. Plaster rained down. Everyone froze. "Nobody move!" The servant lowered the shotgun to point at Silas. Except it wasn't a servant. It was James Whitaker in borrowed livery, and his hands were steady on the weapon. "Territorial Marshal's office. You're all under arrest." More men appeared from doorways and windows, deputies, all armed, all with weapons trained on Silas and his men. They'd been there the whole time, Coulter realized, waiting, listening, gathering evidence. James met Coulter's eyes across the parlor. "Your son's fine, safe with the real marshal back at my freight office. That blanket came from my daughter's baby. We needed to make sure Silas incriminated himself completely before we moved in." The relief was so intense, Coulter nearly collapsed. His son was alive. Safe. Not in Silas's hands, but protected by people who could actually defend him. Silas realized what had happened and tried to bring his pistol around, but 3 deputies hit him simultaneously. He went down hard, weapon clattering across marble. His men surrendered without a fight, smart enough to know when they were beaten. Calhoun sat frozen in his wheelchair, staring at the documents still scattered across his lap, like they might spontaneously combust. "Raymond Calhoun," James said formally. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation of murder, and about 15 other charges I'll read to you once we get you locked up." "You can't do this," Calhoun sputtered. "I have rights. I have lawyers. Your lawyers are in custody too, along with everyone else named in those documents." James gestured to his deputies. "Take him." They hauled Calhoun out of his wheelchair roughly enough to make the old man yelp. His protests faded as they dragged him toward the door and whatever cell was waiting for him. Silas was next, bleeding from where he'd hit his head on the marble, but conscious and furious. He locked eyes with Coulter as deputies pulled him past. "This isn't over," Silas hissed. "Too many powerful people involved. They'll get out. They'll come after you." "Maybe." Coulter's voice was flat, drained of emotion. "But you won't be there to see it." Silas's expression twisted with rage, but the deputies hauled him out before he could respond. Then it was just Coulter, Rowan, James, and a parlor that looked like a storm had torn through it. "How?" Coulter asked. "How did you know we'd be here?" "Burke." James lowered the shotgun and propped it against the wall. "He came to me this afternoon, told me what was happening. Said you'd probably try something stupid like confronting Calhoun publicly. I contacted the Territorial Marshal's office, showed them the evidence Burke had already given me, and we set this up." "Burke gave you evidence?" Rowan sounded stunned. "Copies of everything. Said he was leaving town but wanted insurance that the truth got out even if you failed." James managed a tired smile. "Man might be a criminal, but apparently he's got some kind of conscience left." Coulter thought about Thomas Burke disappearing into the night while they walked into danger. Part of him wanted to hate the lawyer for abandoning them. But another part, the part that understood desperate people making impossible choices, couldn't quite manage it. "My son," he said. "I need to see him." "Marshall's got him safe at my office. Said the baby's been sleeping most of the evening. Doesn't seem worse for wear." James clapped a hand on Coulter's shoulder. "Let's get you to him." They left Calhoun's estate in a wagon James had waiting. Deputies were still swarming the property, rounding up guests for questioning and cataloging evidence. It would take months to sort through the conspiracy completely, to identify everyone involved and build cases against them all. But tonight, Coulter didn't care about any of that. Tonight, he just wanted to hold his son. The freight office was warm and well lit when they arrived. A man in a marshal's uniform stood guard outside, and when he saw James, he opened the door without comment. Inside, sitting in a chair near the stove and rocking a sleeping baby, was a woman Coulter didn't recognize.
She had kind eyes and gray hair, and when she saw him, she smiled. "Mr. Grayson, I presume." She stood carefully, keeping the baby secure against her shoulder. "I'm Marshall Dawson's wife. Been watching this little one all evening. He's been an angel." Coulter crossed the room on unsteady legs and held out his arms. Mrs. Dawson transferred the baby with practiced ease, and suddenly Coulter was holding his son again, feeling the small, warm weight of him, breathing in that particular baby smell that meant safe and alive and still here. He sat down hard in the nearest chair and just held him, not trusting himself to speak. The baby stirred slightly, made a small sound of contentment, and settled back into sleep against his father's chest. Rowan appeared beside him, one hand resting gently on the baby's back. She looked as emotionally wrung out as Coulter felt, eyes red, jaw tight, shoulders shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. "He's okay," she whispered. "We did it. He's okay." "We did it," Coulter repeated, but the words felt hollow. Yes, his son was safe. Yes, Calhoun and Silas were in custody. But Evelyn was still dead, murdered in frozen mountains while trying to protect this child, and nothing they'd accomplished tonight brought her back. James appeared with coffee and blankets. Marshall Dawson arrived shortly after, a stern-faced man who congratulated them on their bravery while making it clear they'd be giving formal statements in the morning. Mrs. Dawson fussed over the baby, checking him thoroughly and declaring him perfectly healthy despite everything. The night blurred after that. Statements, questions. More coffee, Rowan sitting beside Coulter in exhausted silence while officials came and went. The baby waking once to eat, then falling back asleep like nothing unusual had happened. Dawn was breaking when Marshall Dawson finally told them they could leave. "We'll need you both to stay in Helena for at least a few weeks," he said. "There'll be trials, testimonies, probably more evidence to review, but as far as tonight goes, you're free to rest." James offered them a room above his freight office. Coulter accepted without discussion, too tired to think about alternatives. They climbed the stairs in silence, and Coulter laid his son in a proper cradle James had somehow procured while they were at the marshal's office. "Get some sleep," James said from the doorway. "I'll be downstairs if you need anything." He left, closing the door softly behind him. Coulter stood watching his son sleep, unable to look away. Rowan moved to stand beside him, and they stayed like that for a long time, neither speaking, both processing everything that had happened. "What now?" Rowan finally asked. Coulter didn't have an answer. The conspiracy was exposed, but unraveling it completely would take time. People would face trials. Some would hang. Others might escape justice through legal maneuvering or connections they still maintained. And through it all, he'd have to raise a son who would grow up without knowing his mother. "Now we survive," Coulter said quietly. "We raise him. We make sure Evelyn's sacrifice meant something. And after that?" He looked at Rowan properly for the first time since they'd left Calhoun's estate. Saw the exhaustion carved into her face, the weight she'd been carrying since her own family died, the cautious hope in her eyes that maybe, finally, some measure of justice had been served. "After that," he said, "I don't know. One day at a time, I guess." Rowan nodded like that was answer enough. She moved toward the second bed James had set up and sat down heavily, pulling off her boots with hands that shook from fatigue. "Coulter," she said as he settled into the chair beside the cradle. "Yeah?" "Thank you for trusting me. With him. With everything. Thank you for staying." Coulter looked down at his sleeping son. "For fighting when you could have walked away." "Wasn't going to walk away." Rowan laid back on the bed, eyes already closing. "Made a promise to your wife. Doesn't end just because the danger's over." Coulter wanted to ask what that meant for tomorrow and all the days after, but sleep was pulling him down too hard to fight, and the questions could wait. For now, his son was safe. For now, that was enough. The trial started 3 weeks later. Coulter spent those weeks in a kind of suspended reality, existing in the space between the man he'd been at Black Hollow Ranch and whoever he was becoming now. He gave statements to prosecutors, identified documents, sat in offices answering the same questions 5 different ways, while his son slept in a basket beside him, or fussed in Rowan's arms when Coulter's patience wore too thin to keep his voice calm. Helena felt temporary, like a train station where they were waiting for something to carry them toward whatever came next. James let them stay above the freight office rent-free, and his wife brought meals they barely tasted. Rowan spent hours reading through newspapers that covered the scandal with the kind of breathless horror that sold copies. Frontier murder conspiracy exposed. Territorial elite implicated in infant deaths. Justice comes for Helena's powerful. Raymond Calhoun's name appeared in every article. So did Silas Creed's. And buried in the third or fourth paragraph of most stories, Evelyn's name showed up too. The woman who'd started the investigation, who died trying to expose the truth, whose husband and a frontier midwife had finished what she'd begun. Coulter stopped reading after the first few days. The words felt like they were about strangers, not his life. The first trial was Silas Creed's. Coulter attended every day of it, sitting in the back of the courtroom with the baby on his lap and Rowan beside him. The prosecution laid out evidence methodically: the ledger, Burke's documents, testimony from families whose children had died under suspicious circumstances. Witnesses described how Silas had ingratiated himself into ranches and homesteads, gained trust, then created opportunities for infants to die in ways that looked natural. Silas sat through it all with his expression locked somewhere between defiant and resigned. When the prosecutor asked if he had anything to say in his own defense, he stood and looked directly at Coulter. "I did what I was paid to do," Silas said, voice carrying across the courtroom. "Nothing more, nothing less. If that makes me a monster, fine. But everyone in this room has done things they're not proud of for money. I'm just honest about it." The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to hang, and Silas accepted it without visible reaction. As deputies led him out, he paused beside where Coulter sat. "Your wife didn't beg," Silas said quietly, just loud enough for Coulter to hear. "When my men had her in those mountains, she didn't cry or plead. Just told them they'd burn in hell for what they were doing. Thought you should know she went out with her spine straight." Then he was gone, and Coulter was left holding his son while trying to process whether that information made Evelyn's death better or worse. Rowan's hand found his shoulder and squeezed, grounding him before grief could pull him under completely. Raymond Calhoun's trial came next, and it was uglier. His lawyers fought every piece of evidence, challenged every witness, tried to paint him as a frail old man being persecuted by people who wanted his money. But Burke's documentation was too thorough, too detailed. The signed contracts spoke for themselves. Coulter testified on the third day. He stood in front of a packed courtroom and described finding his son barely breathing in a sealed nursery. Described Rowan arriving with Evelyn's ring and a warning that probably saved his child's life. Described running through frozen mountains while hired killers hunted them. Calhoun's lawyer tried to rattle him during cross-examination, suggesting Coulter had fabricated evidence out of grief-driven delusion. Coulter just looked at the old man sitting at the defense table and spoke directly to him. "You tried to murder my son because you wanted money that didn't belong to you," Coulter said, ignoring the lawyer's objections. "You had my wife killed because she figured out what you were doing, and the only thing you regret is getting caught." The judge sustained the lawyer's objection, but it didn't matter. The jury had heard what they needed to hear. Guilty. Death by hanging, same as Silas. More trials followed over the next 2 months. Some of the powerful men named in Burke's documents managed to avoid conviction through legal maneuvering or lack of direct evidence tying them to specific deaths. But enough went down that the conspiracy crumbled completely. The territorial governor resigned. A federal judge was impeached. Business leaders fled to other territories or tried to rebuild reputations that would never fully recover. Thomas Burke was never found. Rumors placed him in San Francisco or Mexico or dead in an unmarked grave somewhere. Coulter didn't particularly care which. The lawyer had given them the evidence that broke the conspiracy, and that was enough. Spring came to Montana while the trials dragged on. Snow melted, trails opened, and one morning Coulter woke up and realized he couldn't stay in Helena anymore. The town had served its purpose, but it wasn't home. Would never be home. "We should go back to Black Hollow Ranch," he said to Rowan over breakfast in the freight office kitchen. The baby sat in a high chair James had built, gumming a piece of bread and making a mess that would have horrified Evelyn, but made Coulter smile despite himself. Rowan set down her coffee cup. "You sure? A lot of bad memories there. Good ones, too." Coulter wiped breadcrumbs from his son's face. "It's where Evelyn and I built our life, where this little man was born. Feels wrong to just abandon it." "What about the ranch hands, Silas's people?" "Most of them quit or got arrested, but the land's still there. the house, the horses. Coulter met her eyes across the table. I can't bring Evelyn back, but I can make sure her son grows up in the place she loved. Rowan was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. What about me? The question hung in the air between them. They'd been living in close quarters for months now, sharing child-rearing duties, sitting through trials together, existing in a kind of partnership neither had explicitly defined. Coulter had gotten used to waking up and finding Rowan already awake with the baby, to hearing her humming while she worked, to the way she'd hand him coffee without being asked when the day felt particularly heavy. He'd gotten used to her being there. Come with us, he said. Ranch can always use another hand, and someone's got to make sure I don't kill this boy through incompetence. Coulter, I'm not asking for anything except help. He rushed the words out before she could refuse. You said you made a promise to Evelyn to protect him. Well, he's going to need protecting for about 18 more years, and I can't do it alone. Rowan's expression was unreadable. You know what people will say. Widow and widower, living under the same roof, raising a child together. Let them talk. Coulter surprised himself with how little he cared. Anyone who's got opinions about how we're handling this can come out to Black Hollow Ranch and do better themselves. A smile tugged at the corner of Rowan's mouth. You've gotten mean. I've gotten practical. He stood and started clearing dishes, needing something to do with his hands. Look, I'm not trying to replace Evelyn. Nobody could do that. But you're good with him, and he's already attached to you, and frankly, I sleep better knowing you're around in case something goes wrong. That's the most romantic proposal I've ever heard, Rowan said dryly. It's not a proposal, it's a job offer. Right. A job. She stood too and took the dishes from him, setting them in the wash basin. For the record, I wasn't waiting for romantic. I buried that with my husband 4 years ago. So you'll come. Rowan looked at the baby, who was now trying to grab his own feet and succeeding only in nearly tipping the high chair over. She caught it without thinking, steadied him, and met Coulter's eyes with something that might have been resignation or relief. I'll come, she said. But if you expect me to cook and clean like a proper frontier wife, you're going to be disappointed. I expect you to help keep my son alive and shoot anyone who tries to hurt him. Everything else we'll figure out as we go. Deal. They left Helena a week later with James's help and the blessing of Marshall Dawson, who'd become something close to a friend during the long months of testimony. The ride back to Black Hollow Ranch took 5 days, much slower than their desperate flight in the opposite direction. The baby was bigger now, more alert, able to sit up with support and grab at anything within reach. He laughed when the horse's gait bounced him, and he cried when he was hungry or tired or just generally annoyed with the world. Coulter loved every second of it. The ranch looked different when they finally rode up the long drive. Smaller somehow, more weathered. The barn needed repairs and winter had damaged some of the outbuildings. But the main house stood solid, and when Coulter pushed open the front door, the smell of home hit him hard enough to make his eyes burn. Rowan stood in the doorway behind him, holding the baby. It's nice, she said quietly. It's a mess, Coulter corrected, looking at dust-covered furniture and floors that hadn't been cleaned in months. But it's ours. They spent the next week making the house livable again. Rowan attacked the cleaning with the same fierce efficiency she brought to everything, while Coulter handled repairs and tried to assess what the ranch needed to function again. The work was exhausting and endless, but it felt good. Felt like building instead of just surviving. One evening, about 2 weeks after their return, Coulter found himself in the nursery. He'd been avoiding it since they got back. Too many memories of finding his son barely breathing, of Rowan ripping open windows and saving a life Coulter had nearly lost through ignorance. But tonight he made himself walk in and really look at it. The cradle where his son had almost died was still there. So was the rocking chair where Evelyn used to sit and sing lullabies. The window Rowan had opened stood closed again now, but Coulter crossed to it and pushed it wide, letting fresh spring air flow through. Thought I'd find you here. Coulter turned to see Rowan in the doorway, the baby drowsy against her shoulder. She'd changed into one of the work dresses they'd bought in Helena, and her hair was coming loose from its bun in ways that made her look younger somehow. Just thinking, Coulter said. About? Everything. Nothing. He gestured around the nursery. This room nearly killed him. Now it's just a room again. Rowan moved to stand beside him at the window. Outside, the sun was setting over mountains that had looked murderous in winter, but seemed almost gentle in spring light. "Rooms are just rooms," she said. "It's what we do in them that matters." The baby made a sound, not quite awake, not quite asleep. Rowan swayed slightly, that automatic movement every caregiver learned to soothe a restless child. "He's getting heavy," she said. "Won't be long before he's walking and getting into everything. Can't wait." Coulter meant it. Every milestone felt like a victory over the men who'd tried to prevent this child from having milestones at all. "What are you going to tell him?" Rowan asked. "When he's old enough to ask about his mother?" Coulter had been wondering that himself. How do you explain to a child that his mother died fighting to protect him? That she'd ridden into mountains knowing she might not return, all to stop men from hurting babies she'd never met? "The truth, I guess," he said finally. "That she was brave and stubborn and cared more about doing what was right than staying safe. That she loved him enough to die for him." "That's a lot to put on a kid." "Maybe. But lying would be worse." Coulter looked at his son, peaceful in Rowan's arms. "He deserves to know who she really was, not some sanitized version that makes it easier to swallow." Rowan nodded slowly. "What about me? What do you tell him about me?" The question surprised Coulter. "What do you want me to tell him?" "I don't know." She shifted the baby slightly, adjusting her grip. "I'm not his mother. But I'm not just some hired help either. Somewhere in between, I guess." Coulter thought about the past months. Rowan feeding his son in the middle of the night while Coulter slept, standing beside him during trials, riding through blizzards to keep this child safe. She'd earned a place in their lives that didn't have a clean label. "I'll tell him you're family," Coulter said. "That you showed up when we needed you most and stayed even when it would have been easier to leave. That's more than most people do." Something shifted in Rowan's expression, not quite a smile, but close. "Family. I like that." The baby woke fully then and immediately started fussing for food. Rowan handed him to Coulter while she went to prepare a bottle. They'd found a better feeding system than diluted milk and cloths, though it still took trial and error to get it right. Coulter stood in the nursery holding his son and felt something he hadn't experienced since before Evelyn died. Not happiness exactly. Too much grief still lived in his chest for simple happiness. But maybe peace. Or the beginning of it. The months that followed developed a rhythm. Coulter worked the ranch with help from 2 new hands James had recommended. Young men who needed work and didn't ask questions about what had happened that winter. Rowan handled the house and the baby with the same competence she brought to delivering children and shooting men who deserved it. They existed somewhere in the space between business partners and family, and if the arrangement confused the occasional visitor, neither of them particularly cared. The baby grew, started crawling, then pulling himself up on furniture, made sounds that almost resembled words, developed a personality that was part Evelyn's stubbornness and part Coulter's quiet determination, with occasional flashes of humor that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Coulter caught himself smiling more often, not the forced expressions of someone trying to move past grief, but genuine moments of joy when the baby did something funny or Rowan made a dry observation that surprised a laugh out of him. The weight in his chest didn't disappear, but it shifted enough that breathing got easier. One afternoon in late summer, nearly a year after Evelyn's death, Coulter found Rowan in the garden she'd planted behind the house. She was on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds with methodical focus, while the baby sat nearby playing with smooth stones. "Need to talk to you about something," Coulter said. Rowan looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "That sounds serious." "Maybe." He sat down on the ground beside his son, who immediately crawled into his lap and tried to grab his hat. "I've been thinking about the future, about what happens as he gets older." "What about it?" "He's going to need stability, people he can count on, a home that feels permanent instead of temporary." Coulter pulled off his hat and let the baby play with it. "Right now, we're in this strange arrangement where you're helping out but could leave any time. I want to make it more official." Rowan set down the weeds she'd been pulling. "Official how?" "Adoption papers, making you his legal guardian along with me. So if something happens to me, he doesn't end up with some distant relative who didn't give a damn about him when people were trying to kill him." He'd expected surprise, maybe resistance. What he didn't expect was for Rowan's eyes to fill with tears. "Rowan, sorry." She wiped at her face with dirty hands, leaving streaks across her cheeks. I haven't been anyone's mother in 4 years. Convinced myself I didn't deserve to be after I couldn't save my own children. And you're offering me that again. You've already been his mother in every way that counts, Coulter said quietly. This just makes it legal.
Rowan was quiet for a long moment, staring at the baby who'd grabbed Coulter's hat and was now trying to eat it. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. What would Evelyn think? About me raising her son? Coulter had asked himself that question more times than he could count, and every time he came back to the same answer. I think she'd be grateful you kept your promise to protect him, and I think she'd trust you to help make sure he grows up to be someone she'd be proud of.
You really believe that? I do. Rowan nodded slowly, then reached over and took the hat from the baby before he could destroy it completely.
Then yes, I'll do it. Legal papers, all of it. They drew up the documents that fall with help from a lawyer in Helena who'd somehow avoided being implicated in the conspiracy. The process was straightforward. Rowan became the baby's legal guardian alongside Coulter, with full parental rights and responsibilities. When the lawyer asked for the child's full name to complete the paperwork, Coulter realized they'd been calling him variations of the baby, or little man, for nearly a year. He looked at Rowan. Evelyn wanted to name him Thomas after her father. Thomas is good, Rowan agreed. What about a middle name? Coulter thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. His wife dying to protect this child, Rowan riding through a blizzard to deliver a warning, both of them fighting through impossible odds to keep one small life safe. Thomas Evelyn Grayson, he said, so he carries her name with him always. Rowan smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. She'd like that. Winter came again, but this time the ranch was prepared. They'd hired enough hands to manage the livestock properly, stored adequate supplies, and reinforced the outbuildings against Montana's brutal cold. The nursery stayed warm but not suffocating, and Thomas, no longer the baby, but a small person with a name and personality, thrived through the dark months. On the anniversary of Evelyn's death, Coulter rode out to the place where she'd been ambushed in the mountains. Rowan had offered to come with him, but he'd needed to do this alone. He stood in snow that had probably buried her body the day she died, and he finally let himself properly grieve, not the desperate, drowning grief of those first weeks, but the deep, lasting sorrow of knowing someone was gone and would never come back. He cried until he had nothing left, until the cold started seeping through his coat and forced him to move or freeze. He didn't expect forgiveness or absolution, didn't expect Evelyn's ghost to appear and tell him everything would be okay. He just stood in the place where she'd fought and died, and he made her a promise. I'm raising our son with someone who loves him like you did, he said to the empty mountains. I'm making sure he knows your name and what you died for. And I'm trying to be the kind of father you believed I could be, even when I didn't believe it myself. The wind answered him, cold and indifferent. Coulter took that as response enough. He rode back to Black Hollow Ranch as the sun was setting. Smoke rose from the chimney, and through the windows he could see Rowan moving around the kitchen while Thomas played on the floor. It looked like a home. Felt like one, too, in ways it hadn't since Evelyn disappeared. Spring came early the year Thomas turned 2. He was walking now, running, actually, with the kind of fearless energy that gave Coulter constant heart attacks. He climbed everything, grabbed everything, put everything in his mouth that wasn't nailed down. He called Coulter Papa and Rowan Mama without any confusion about who was who or what those words meant. One evening, after Thomas had finally exhausted himself into sleep, Coulter and Rowan sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. It was the kind of peaceful moment that felt earned after everything they'd survived. Do you ever think about leaving? Coulter asked. Finding a place of your own, starting fresh somewhere nobody knows your history? Rowan was quiet for a moment, rocking slowly in the chair Coulter had built last summer. Sometimes, she admitted. Then I think about what I'd be leaving behind, and I can't make it make sense. What would you be leaving? You, Thomas. This place that somehow became home when I wasn't paying attention. She looked at him in the fading light. I spent 4 years wandering after my family died, convinced I didn't deserve another one. But maybe that's not how it works. Maybe family isn't something you deserve or don't deserve. It's just something you build with people who show up and stay. Coulter understood that. He'd spent months trying to figure out what Rowan was to him. Friend, partner, co-parent, something else entirely. And maybe the answer was simpler than he'd been making it. She was family. Not because she replaced Evelyn, Not because grief or convenience had thrown them together, but because they'd fought for the same thing and kept fighting long after most people would have quit. Because she'd kept her promise to a dying woman and helped raise that woman's son with the kind of fierce love that didn't need biology to be real. "For what it's worth," Coulter said, "I'm glad you stayed." "Yeah? Yeah, Thomas needs you, and I—" He paused, trying to find words for something he wasn't sure he understood himself. "I need you too, not the way I needed Evelyn, but in its own way just as important." Rowan's hand found his in the space between their chairs. Her grip was warm and calloused and steady. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "This is where I belong." They sat like that until full dark, hands linked, watching stars appear over mountains that had tried to kill them and failed. Somewhere inside the house, Thomas slept peacefully in the nursery that had almost been his grave. Tomorrow he'd wake up and demand breakfast and run Coulter ragged, chasing him around the ranch. And Rowan would be there to help, the way she'd been there for every challenge and victory since that first terrible morning when she'd arrived carrying a dead woman's ring and a warning. Life wasn't perfect. The grief over Evelyn's death still lived in Coulter's chest and probably always would. Some mornings he woke up expecting to see her beside him and had to remember all over again that she was gone. The trials had closed, but news still filtered back occasionally about men who'd escaped justice or found ways to rebuild power despite their exposure. But Thomas was alive, growing, laughing. He'd never know his mother except through stories, but those stories would be good ones, true ones. About a woman brave enough to die fighting evil and stubborn enough to make sure that fight continued even after she was gone. And he'd grow up with two parents who loved him fiercely, one who'd given him life, one who'd saved it, and one who'd promised to protect it no matter the cost. That felt like enough. Not everything Coulter had wanted or planned, but enough to build a future on. As they finally stood to head inside, Rowan paused at the door. "You know what Thomas asked me yesterday?" she said. "What?" "If you and I were going to get married." Coulter's heart skipped. "What did you tell him?" "That grown-up decisions are complicated and he should focus on not breaking his neck climbing the barn." She smiled slightly. "But it made me think about what we're doing here, what it looks like from the outside." "What does it look like?" "Like two people who went through hell together and came out the other side still standing." Rowan met his eyes. "Like family, I guess, whatever shape that takes." Coulter thought about marriage, about what it would mean and whether either of them was ready for it. He'd loved Evelyn with the kind of passion that burned bright and fast. What he felt for Rowan was different, slower, steadier, built on shared survival rather than romance. Maybe that was exactly what both of them needed. "Ask me again in a year," he said finally, "when we've had time to be sure we're making the choice for the right reasons." And what are the right reasons? Not loneliness, not convenience, not because it's what people expect. Coulter touched her face gently. "But because we want to, and because it makes us both better than we are alone." Rowan leaned into his touch for just a moment. "I can wait a year." They went inside together, checking on Thomas one last time before heading to their separate rooms. The house settled into familiar nighttime sounds. Wind against shutters, floorboards creaking, the small noises of home. Coulter lay in bed and thought about the future. About Thomas growing up strong and healthy, asking questions about his mother and getting honest answers. About Rowan staying, becoming more than just the woman who'd saved his son's life. About Black Hollow Ranch continuing despite everything that had tried to destroy it. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Raising a child never was, and doing it while carrying the weight of everything they'd survived made it harder. There would be difficult conversations, painful anniversaries, moments when grief ambushed them both without warning, but they'd face it together. Not because they had to, but because they'd chosen to. Because somewhere between that first desperate morning and tonight, they'd become the kind of family that wasn't about perfection or traditional definitions. It was about people who showed up, who stayed, who fought for each other when the world tried to pull them apart. That was enough. It had to be enough. And lying in the dark, listening to his son breathe peacefully in the next room, Coulter decided it was. The story didn't end with perfect closure or all wounds healed. It ended with survival, with small victories built on sacrifice, with a child who'd grow up knowing he was loved by people who'd nearly died, keeping him safe. It ended with Rowan humming in the kitchen while Thomas laughed, with Coulter fixing fences and planning for spring planting, with all of them building something that looked like hope on the ruins of what they'd lost. Sometimes that's all you got. Sometimes that was everything. And on a ranch in Montana where winter had tried its best to bury them all, where evil had worn trusted faces and good had come from unexpected places, three people who'd survived the unsurvivable chose to keep surviving together. One day at a time, one moment at a time. One stubborn, imperfect, beautiful step forward at a time. That was their story, and it was enough.